Chapter 411. In reality, Yi Jingtu's plan had already achieved its goal. From the very beginning, his goal was to eliminate the family first. However, things did not go according to Yi Jingtu's plan, but the family's goal of being eliminated was still achieved. Next, they just had to find a way to get rid of Zhou Rong. Then, the three great clans could rightfully claim the Frost Soul Origin Crystal. All these years, the family had developed rapidly under Ammonian's management. Without the help of a Gene Dan cultivator, the family's business had reached its peak. Although the three great clans were enemies with the family, they could not help but admire Ammonian's business acumen. However, this admiration was mostly built on anger. The family had snatched away a few of the Yi family's big business deals 2 years ago. Yi Jingtu had always been brooding over this. After suffering so much from the family, it would be strange if he did not hate them. The three great clans could not wait for the family to suffer. The sooner they fell, the better. As soon as Yi Jingtu finished speaking, Dong Yuan added, "Ammonian, since there's no one left in the family, why don't you admit defeat? It'll save everyone some time." Ammonian lowered his head and sighed. He knew that there was nothing to say. Just as he was about to admit defeat, a calm voice came from behind him. "Who said there's no one left? There's so many people here. Are you blind?" As soon as these words were spoken, the surrounding cultivators gasped. They all looked in the direction of the voice and saw that half of the Straw Hat cultivator's face was hidden under the straw hat. Only his chin and mouth could be seen. The Straw Hat cultivator even had a piece of straw in his mouth. This kid just offended Yi Jingtu not long ago. Now, he's overestimating himself and speaking rudely to Dong Yuan. What's going on in his head? Someone could not understand. Why do you care so much? This guy is probably tired of living. Those who knew the Straw Hat cultivator all looked suspicious. "Su Mao, did you take the wrong medicine today?" An old man, standing beside Ammonian, said in a low voice. The old man's voice carried a telekinesis attack. However, it did not have any killing power. It only had the effect of waking one up. Ammonian had noticed the Straw Hat cultivator earlier, but he had forgotten about him due to his heavy heart. Now, he was looking at the Straw Hat cultivator with a hint of anger. Right now, the clan is already in dire straits, yet you're still boasting like the world isn't in chaos. Isn't this clearly trying to embarrass the clan? Yi Jingtu glanced at the Straw Hat cultivator from the corner of his eyes and sneered. "I haven't settled the score with you yet, but you brat came out on your own. One might be able to survive a heavenly calamity, but one cannot survive a self-inflicted calamity. Since you're courting death, you can't blame anyone else." Impudent. Yi Jingtu suddenly snorted coldly and rebuked angrily. A wave of pressure swept across the sky, causing the expressions of the surrounding cultivators to tighten. In his battle with Old Gun, Yi Jingtu had burned his blood essence and consumed so much of his energy. Yet, he was still able to release such a powerful pressure at this moment. As expected of a Gene Dan cultivator. "Who are you calling blind? How can a junior speak to a senior without any manners? Why would the clan hire a lowly cultivator like you?" Yi Jingtu continued. "Senior Yi, please forgive this servant of mine for being immature. I'll definitely discipline him when we get back," the old man standing behind Ammonian hurriedly said. "Humph. How you discipline him when you get back is your own business. You don't have to tell me. Since this brat is so arrogant, why don't you let him fight? Your clan will be the last to fight." Yi Jingtu didn't buy it. Although the Straw Hat cultivator's words were a little harsh, he was still a member of the clan. Whether they fought or not was up to the clan. As the head of the family, Ammonian couldn't allow the clan to be manipulated no matter how cold his heart was. Even if the other party was a Gene Dan cultivator. Ammonian's cultivation level might not be high, and his talent in cultivation was limited, but other than that, he was definitely a qualified family head. In fact, he was even more qualified than those family heads who only knew how to cultivate. As long as Ammonian was around, he would never allow outsiders to order the clan around, nor would he watch as the family's cultivators died for nothing. Fights between Gene Dan cultivators could be stopped when appropriate. An early-stage foundation establishment cultivator could easily take their lives. Even if they didn't die, their cultivation level would be crippled. Although Amanian was also very angry at the Straw Hat cultivator's recklessness, Su Mao had been cautious and conscientious ever since he joined the clan. He had done many things for the clan, and even if he didn't make any contributions, he still worked hard. Even if he had to be punished, it was the clan's business. It had nothing to do with anyone else. Protecting his own was Ammonian's usual style. It was precisely because of Ammonian's conciliatory attitude that the family was able to remain united even without a golden core cultivator holding down the fort. Brother Yi, the clan won't fight this round. We admit defeat and withdraw from the fight. You can continue. The clan will leave now. And Ammonian said in a tone that was neither servile nor overbearing. Yi Jingtu's eyes narrowed. The clan can admit defeat and leave, but that guy in the straw hat must stay. Brother Dong is a Jin Dan cultivator. How can we just let it go when a junior called a blind? And Ammonian, don't you know that Jin Dan cultivators are not to be humiliated? If we let it go today, how can Brother Dong still have the face to stand on planet Crimson Sun in the future? What does the clan take Jin Dan cultivators for? Yi Jingtu's tone was firm and firm. Jin Dan cultivators were not to be humiliated. This had always been a tradition in the cultivation world. Strictly speaking, it wasn't that Jin Dan cultivators were not to be humiliated, but that high-ranking cultivators were not to be humiliated. In other words, this was the unspoken rule of a world where the strong preyed on the weak. There was only one outcome for a rabbit that argued with a wolf. It would become the wolf's food. This rule had never changed in the cultivation world since ancient times. It was just that the way it was expressed was different. After the arrival of the Great Cultivation Era, the relationship between cultivators became much more relaxed. It was not like the Cultivation Era in the Wild Antiquity Era, where a single disrespectful look could lead to death. However, this did not mean that one could be unbridled and disrespectful to high-ranking cultivators. If there was a price to be paid. Sometimes, it was even the price of one's life. Otherwise, where would the dignity of high-ranking cultivators be? All the cultivators understood Yi Jingtu's words. It had been this way for tens of thousands of years. This was an unchanging law that was deeply rooted in the hearts of cultivators. In fact, it was the same even in the mortal world. There are no exceptions for any race or group, including the dark ghosts. Senior Yi is right. A cultivator agreed. Who does this straw hat cultivator think he is? He speaks without thinking. How dare he speak so rudely to a Jin Dan cultivator? He should be taught a lesson. That's right. We have to let him fight. If he wants to have the right to speak, he has to show us his strength first. Many cultivators joined in the commotion. Ammonian wanted to protect him, but he had no reason to do so. He did not expect Yi Jingtu to be so serious. Ammonian's expression darkened. If the family was not so troublesome, perhaps he would protect Su Mao at all costs. However, he did not have that much energy now. Ammonian turned to Insinuo and said, Sinuo, go and give Su Mao 20,000 spirit stones as severance. The family can't protect him this time. Tell him to take care of himself. And Sinuo looked at his father's lonely face and nodded slightly. He turned and handed a storage bag to the straw hat cultivator. Su Mao, this is your severance. From now on, you have nothing to do with the family. I told you to take care of yourself. What's wrong with you today? Why do you keep saying that I want to protect you all of a sudden? Su Mao was Insinuo's bodyguard every time he went out. He even saved Insinuo's life once. Insinuo had some feelings for this cultivator hired by the family. She could not help but say a few more words as she handed over the severance. However, before she could finish her sentence, her delicate little face instantly froze. Her eyes widened and her mouth gaped open. She froze on the spot. When the straw hat cultivator took the storage bag, the face hidden under the straw hat slowly looked up, revealing the smiling face underneath. And Sinuo could not be more familiar with this face. However, she did not expect this man to appear here at this moment. And Sinuo's brain circuit completely shut off for at least 2 seconds. When she came back to her senses, she was even more nervous. "Mr. Li, is that you?" Insinuo exclaimed. At the same time, an indescribable worry flashed across her eyes. Li Daochong had already set up a telekinesis barrier. Even the Jindan cultivators could not penetrate it. Therefore, no one noticed Insinuo's actions. Li Daochong nodded slightly and put away the storage bag. He smiled and said, "Long time no see." Insinuo grabbed Li Daochong's hand and quickly ran to Enmonian. She leaned close to Enmonian's ear and said, "Dad, it's Mr. Li." "What?" Enmonian was stunned. He could not react in time. However, when he turned around and saw the face under the straw hat, he immediately stood up. "Mr. Li, why are you here?" Li Daochong said simply, "I heard that the Frost Soul Origin Crystal has appeared, so I came to take a look." Enmonian nodded and turned around. He looked at Yi Jingtu and said bluntly, "Brother Yi, I apologize to Brother Dong as the head of the Yin family. Tomorrow, the Yin family will send 100,000 spirit stones to Brother Dong as an apology." Enmonian's words came so suddenly that Li Daochong did not expect it either. If it were just cultivators from the Yin family, Enmonian would have already given up. However, Li Daochong was different. He was his savior. Enmonian could not allow Li Daochong to be in danger no matter what. The Yin family was only able to survive until now because of his savior. Now that his savior was being forced to fight against a cultivator from Jindan, how could he, Enmonian, still be considered a human being if he did nothing? 100,000 spirit stones? Enmonian, are you trying to dismiss a beggar? Yi Jingtu said coldly. "Brother Yi, let Brother Dong name a price then." Enmonian gritted his teeth. 10 million spirit stones, Dong Yuan immediately said. Gasp! Everyone sucked in a breath of cold air. Every cultivator who heard this number was shocked. 10 million spirit stones? Even if it was only elementary spirit stones, it was still a huge sum of money. It was a huge sum even for cultivators. "Brother Dong, isn't this price a little too much?" Enmonian was a little anxious. Enmonian, 10 million spirit stones is already very polite. Jindan is not to be humiliated. Do you think it's just empty words? Brother Dong is already being merciful by not killing him on the spot. If this were the ancient era of cultivation, not only would this brat have died, but the entire Yin family would also be buried with him. Yi Jingtu's expression was vicious. Chapter 412. What do you mean? Enmonian, the patriarch wants your family to scram as far away as possible. If you continue to protect this straw hat brat, don't blame us for being impolite. The patriarch of the Yi family, Yi Xiao, said harshly. Enmonian was so angry that his body trembled slightly. He didn't expect the Yi family to fall out with him in public. Yi Xiao, is your Yi family going to attack our Yin family? Enmonian asked in a low voice. The Yin family's current situation wasn't good, but the outside world didn't know about it. Even if the other 3 major families worked together, they wouldn't dare to do anything to the Yin family, let alone the Yi family. Enmonian was confident about this. The Yin family's business covered Planet Crimson Sun and even had partners on Planet Canwu. Although their business wasn't big, they still had some dealings with second-class cultivation planets. The forces on the Scarlet Sun planet didn't have the ability to make a move on the Yin family without alerting anyone. They didn't dare to either. Enmonian looked at Yi Xiao coldly and didn't back down. Even if the Yin family didn't have a Jindan cultivator, he wasn't afraid. Yi Xiao's expression froze. He didn't expect Enmonian to be so protective of a cultivator with a different surname. Yi Xiao didn't know how to respond to Enmonian's words. Although he was the patriarch of the Yi family, he didn't have as much power as Enmonian did in the Yin family. Yi Xiao had to look at the patriarch, Yi Jingtu's expression. Just as Yi Xiao looked at Yi Jingtu, the latter's aura exploded violently. He flew up and appeared in front of Enmonian in an instant. Enmonian was stunned. He would be lying if he said he wasn't afraid. Yi Jingtu was a Jindan cultivator after all. Although he was afraid, Enmonian didn't show it. He met Yi Jingtu's gaze with his chi-gathering realm cultivation. Yi Jingtu smiled contemptuously. Spiritual energy surged around him, and Enmanian was sent flying. If the old man hadn't protected him, Enmanian would have been sent flying over 100 meters away and fell flat on his face. And Sinuo and Ndingbang, who were nearby, were also sent flying by Yijing-Tu's aura. In the blink of an eye, only Yijing-Tu and the Straw Hat Cultivator were left fighting. Yijing-Tu's aura did not manage to push the Straw Hat Cultivator away, but that was not strange. After all, the Straw Hat Cultivator was a Foundation establishment cultivator. Yijing-Tu had expended a lot of energy in his battle with Old Gun. It was unrealistic for him to push a Foundation establishment cultivator away with just his aura. Yijing-Tu was almost 2 meters tall. Those with the black tortoise bloodline were mostly burly. They looked down at the grass hat cultivator with murderous intent in their eyes. From the moment this fellow spoiled his plan, Yijing-Tu had already harbored the intention to kill him. He was just worried that he wouldn't have an excuse to make a move. Now that this fellow had dug a hole for himself, how could Yijing-Tu not push him into it? Yijing-Tu glanced at Manian, who had been sent flying more than 100 meters away. He sneered and said, "Enmanian, my Yi family has no grudge against your own family, so we naturally won't touch you. However, I'm going to make a move on this impudent and disrespectful brat tonight. Who dares to stop me?" Yijing-Tu had made it very clear that he would not touch the family for the time being, but now that he was going to make a move on this brat, he would kill anyone who dared to stop him, including the family. Enmanian wanted to speak, but the old man had sealed his mute acupoint, so he could not move. The old man looked apologetic and said, "Manian, the bigger picture is more important. I don't know why you're protecting this brat, but how can an outsider compare to the entire family? You have to calm down." Enmanian stared blankly at the old man, not moving an inch. And Xinhua and Ndingbang were also restrained by the old man, but they could still speak. And Xinhua said anxiously, "Grandpa Mu, that person is the savior of our family." The old man seemed to understand and nodded slightly. "Little girl, I also guess that this person has a deep relationship with your family. Otherwise, you wouldn't be so protective of him. I can understand how you feel, but you still have to act within your means. You can't help him." After saying that, the old man no longer looked at the three of them. He put his hands behind his back and slowly turned to look at Yijing-Tu and the Straw Hat Cultivator. At that moment, everyone's attention was on the Straw Hat Cultivator. It was as if they could already see the Straw Hat Cultivator being killed by Yijing-Tu. Everyone forgot about the competition. Zhou Rong stood alone in the field. She was not in a hurry and looked at the Straw Hat Cultivator curiously. Zhou Rong also did not understand what was wrong with this guy who was only in the early-stage Foundation establishment realm. How dare he say that the Jin Dan cultivators were blind? Wasn't he asking for a beating? On the other side, Old Gun, who was meditating, narrowed his eyes and closed them again. Bai Yi, on the other hand, opened her eyes and looked for a while longer. The Straw Hat Cultivator gave her a sense of déjà vu, but she could not remember where she had seen him before. Bai Yi did not remember this person. After Yijing-Tu finished speaking in an imposing manner, he looked at the Straw Hat Cultivator as if he was looking at a lamb waiting to be slaughtered. "Kid, if you destroy your own cultivation, kneel 3 times and kowtow 9 times in front of Brother Dong. Then go to the Dong clan and do 10 years of hard labor. Then we Jin Dan cultivators will let you go." Yijing-Tu's voice was loud like a bell, and the sound waves contained a powerful Jin Dan aura. Many cultivators in the distance covered their ears and showed a pained expression. "What if I don't?" The Straw Hat Cultivator raised his head slightly, revealing half of his face, and asked calmly, "Then you can go die." Yijing-Tu said with contempt, "Is that so? How will I die?" The Straw Hat Cultivator continued to ask with interest. When the surrounding cultivators heard this, they all looked at the Straw Hat Cultivator as if they were looking at a dead man. He doesn't know his place. This kid really wants to die. A cultivator could not help but say with his mouth agape. After getting into such a big trouble and being on the verge of death, he still dared to argue with the Jin Dan cultivators? If you don't die, who will? Yijing-Tu's murderous aura was instantly released, and his tone was as cold as ice. "If you want to know so much, then I'll show you." As he spoke, Yi Jingtu's palm struck the straw hat cultivator's chest quickly. "Pa!" There was a crisp sound. Yi Jingtu's palm was easily pushed aside by the straw hat cultivator. Eh! All the cultivators present were stunned, not knowing what was going on. Yi Jingtu's attack was a bit too light. Many people muttered in their hearts. As the person involved, Yi Jingtu's expression changed. He knew very well how much strength he had used in that palm strike. Even if he had used up a lot of his strength, that palm strike was enough to kill an early-stage Foundation establishment cultivator. It was actually pushed aside. Could it be that he had used too much strength and made a mistake in controlling his strength? Yi Jingtu thought of the reason and immediately gathered his strength for another palm strike. This palm strike contained a cultivation technique, and a cyclone was formed in the center of his palm. The second style of the Yi clan's suspended underworld palm, suspended breaking palm. Pa! There was another crisp sound. Yi Jingtu's palm was pushed aside again. "With your little strength, you dare to say that the might of the Jin Dan cannot be insulted? What a joke." The straw hat cultivator shook his head and said. Yi Jingtu was a bit confused. Bang! Suddenly, there was a sound of a chi explosion. The aura of the straw hat cultivator surged like the waves of the sea. Yi Jingtu's expression changed greatly. The aura continued to rise at an astonishing speed from early-stage Foundation establishment to peak Foundation establishment in a short while, and there were no signs of it stopping. He had leaped into the realm of Jin Dan. Chapter 413. The Straw Hat Kid was a cultivator from Jin Dan. Everyone was shocked. Everyone stared at the straw hat cultivator, dumbfounded. Who would have thought that this guy would be a cultivator from Jin Dan? "No, that's impossible," someone stammered. Those who knew the straw hat cultivator were even more incredulous. "Su Mao is already a cultivator from Jin Dan. How is that possible?" Did Su Mao have a fortuitous encounter? A fortuitous encounter? This guy has been with the family for almost 10 years. At that time, he was already in the early stage of the Foundation establishment realm. He hasn't made any breakthroughs in all these years, but his cultivation level has improved slightly, an insider said. After a short moment of dead silence, there was an uproar and a lot of discussion. The 12 Jin Dan cultivators were the most shocked. How could they have known that there was a cultivator from Jin Dan here? None of them had sensed this person's presence. Bai Yi's eyes that had just closed suddenly opened. She looked at the straw hat cultivator with a thoughtful gaze, and then her cherry-red lips curled up. "So it's you," Bai Yi murmured. Soon, her beautiful face froze, and her heart was in turmoil. Not long ago, this guy was only in the mid-stage of the Foundation establishment realm. How could he be a cultivator from Jin Dan in such a short time? This Bai Yi's delicate body stiffened, and she was dumbfounded. Olgun also saw some clues. As a mid-stage Jin Dan cultivator, he was also shocked. The family members were all dumbfounded. And Manian, who had been anxious just a moment ago, was now standing there in a daze. He suddenly realized that he was an idiot. "Does Mr. Li need you to protect him?" And Sinuo's mouth was wide open. There was only shock in her beautiful eyes, and her mind was blank. And Ding Bang, who usually didn't show his emotions, was also dumbfounded. A few months ago, he was drinking and chatting with Li Daochong at the Pure Gold Hotel. At that time, Li Daochong definitely wasn't a Jin Dan. Things always happened to this guy that couldn't be imagined. Jin Dan's prestige can't be insulted? What if I'm also a Jin Dan? The straw hat cultivator's voice slowly sounded, his tone carrying a strong sense of playfulness. Yi Jingtu had never imagined that the An in front of him, who should have been easily squashed to death, was actually a Jin Dan cultivator. The hair on Yi Jingtu's back stood on end, and the killing intent on his body instantly disappeared. The condescending expression on his face also disappeared, leaving only astonishment and a trace of fear. Yi Jingtu had expended too much energy. No matter how strong this straw hat cultivator was at the Jin Dan stage, he was no longer someone he could deal with. However, the straw hat cultivator's words were like a sharp arrow that pierced through Yi Jingtu's arrogance. The superior feeling of being a high-level cultivator vanished like smoke in thin air. Naturally, there was no such thing as respect between cultivators of the same level. To use an inappropriate analogy, if an 80-year-old man said to another 80-year-old man, "Are you blind?" can you say that he is disrespectful? Yi Jingtu's expression was spectacular, but he couldn't say a single word. In fact, he didn't dare to say anything. For the first time, Li Daocheng completely raised his head. He raised his hand and took off his straw hat, revealing his entire face. To the cultivators of Planet Scarlet Sun, this was a very unfamiliar face. However, when they saw this face, everyone's expression became even more shocked. Because he was too young. Even though Bai Yi had already guessed who it was, when Li Daocheng's face was revealed, this Jin Dan female cultivator still pursed her lips as if she was unwilling. A few months ago, this guy still had to call her senior. In such a short time, his cultivation was already on par with hers. What kind of monster was this? That Dong guy is blind. You're also blind. All of you are blind. Li Daocheng looked at Yi Jingtu and said word by word. Yi Jingtu's face twitched. Didn't you say that Jin Dan's prestige can't be insulted? I just said that 3 of you are blind. Do you have a problem with that? Li Daocheng asked in return. Kid, don't think that you can be arrogant just because you're a Jin Dan cultivator. Are you prepared to offend all 12 Jin Dan cultivators here? Dong Yuan said in a deep voice. It was inappropriate for him to say anything after being called out. So what? Li Daocheng said indifferently. Kid, don't be arrogant. There are strong and weak Jin Dan cultivators. If this old man didn't fight just now, killing you would be as easy as killing a dog, Dong Yuan said coldly. Bang! With a muffled sound, Dong Yuan was sent flying. No one saw what happened clearly. They only felt a burst of energy shoot out in an instant, and then Dong Yuan was sent flying. Shimin Jin, who was beside Dong Yuan, didn't react at all. He only knew what had happened when Dong Yuan was sent flying. Pooh! 100 meters away, Dong Yuan spat out a mouthful of blood. His internal organs seemed to have been shattered, and a crack appeared on his Jin Dan. You! Dong Yuan sat on the ground and pointed at Li Daocheng. He could only spit out one word. The blood in his body was churning, and he couldn't say anything. Blood kept flowing out his mouth. Patriarch! The Dong family members and cultivators exclaimed in unison. They rushed to Dong Yuan and helped him up. The Dong family members glared at Li Daocheng. You actually used underhanded means. Li Daocheng looked as if nothing had happened. He only said, underhanded means? You clearly attacked openly. How can you call underhanded because you don't have the ability to see it? Ridiculous. You. The Dong family patriarch, Dong Liming, was so angry that his lungs were about to explode. However, there was nothing he could do. The patriarch was seriously injured, and the other party was a Jin Dan cultivator. He didn't dare to say anything. Yi Jingtu felt a chill run down his spine. He stood 5 meters away from Li Daocheng. He felt an incomparable sense of danger. He wanted to turn around and run, but he couldn't because of his face. There were so many people watching. If he, Yi Jingtu, the patriarch of the Yi family, ran away in fear, he would become the laughingstock of the cultivators of the Scarlet Sun planet in the future. Who are you? Yi Jingtu tried his best to hide his fear and asked, Isn't the Yi family one of the 4 great families of the Scarlet Sun planet? You don't even know who I am. Your information network is really bad. Li Daocheng said disdainfully. The cultivators were a little confused when they heard this. Did this guy mean that he didn't appear out of nowhere? He was famous on the Scarlet Sun planet. At this moment, someone from the Yi family suddenly said, He's the person behind the 3rd Masterine. He appeared in the black market fighting ring a few months ago. People call him Mr. Li. Then, some of the people from the other families who didn't have high status recognized Li Daocheng. Li Daocheng spent most of his time on the Scarlet Sun planet. He didn't have much contact with cultivators. The only time he did was at Shuangyuan town. However, most of the cultivators at that time had died. Only Old Gun and Bai Yi were still alive. The news had not spread. Therefore, those who knew Li Daocheng were the people at the bottom. At most, the cultivators had only heard of him. Mr. Li. Yijingtu also remembered that he had heard of this person a few months ago. However, he didn't pay much attention to him at that time. A few people like this would appear every year, but they were just small characters. At most, they could act like tyrants among mortals. In the eyes of cultivators, they weren't worth paying attention to. In his 8 lifetimes, Yijingtu would never have thought that a golden core cultivator would go to the black market's fighting ring, a place that other cultivators would not take notice of. Now we should talk about the 10 million spirit stones. You said that you wanted the family to compensate 10 million spirit stones? Li Daochong said with a smile. Mr. Li, since you're a Jin Dan cultivator, we're all of the same generation. There's no need to talk about disrespecting your elders. Let's drop this matter. Yi Jingta didn't care about his reputation at this time. Although he was admitting defeat, what he said was the truth. It also gave him a way out. It was better than running away with his face down. At least he wouldn't embarrass himself. After speaking, Yi Jingta turned to leave. However, before he could turn around, a faint voice sounded. Drop this matter. Did I agree? Yi Jingta paused. He braced himself and put on a strong face. What do you want? Li Daochong's eyes were calm. He said indifferently, You provoke me in front of so many people. You wanted to kowtow, compensate me, and make me do hard labor? Jin Dan's prestige can't be humiliated. I agree. Since you were so disrespectful to me, then compensate me with 10 million spirit stones. After that, this matter will drop. Yi Jingtu was so angry that he almost vomited blood. He suppressed his anger and said in a low voice, Mr. Li, don't push your luck. Let's all take a step back and let this matter drop. It won't hurt anyone. When the cultivators heard Mr. Li's words, they were all shocked. Wasn't this guy trying to pick a fight? Old thing, I've already taken a step back. Don't test my patience. Li Daochong's faint smile disappeared. He said coldly, Good. Yi Jingta said good 3 times in a row. His tone was filled with anger. He then said, You're going to shed all pretense of cordiality. Noisy. Li Daochong swung his hand and slapped Yi Jingtu. Slap. The slap landed heavily on Yi Jingtu's face. Yi Jingtu was sent flying. He spun in the air countless times and landed dozens of meters away. Half of his face was swollen like a pig's head. You're courting death. A few cultivators with high cultivation levels among the Yi family cultivators shouted. The Yi family's overall strength was above the Dong family. Although Yi Jingtu was the only true Jin Dan cultivator, due to the Black Tortoise bloodline, there were still a few cultivators at the peak of the Foundation establishment stage who had the strength to challenge Jin Dan cultivators. Seeing their patriarch being slapped in public, how could they tolerate it? A few of them rushed into the sky and pounced on Li Daochong. They looked like they wanted to tear Li Daochong to pieces. Buzz. There was a tremor. Li Daochong disappeared from where he was and went up to meet the attack. Bang, bang, bang. Chapter 414. One strike. With just one strike, 3 cultivators at the peak of the Foundation establishment stage were beaten half to death. How can ordinary Jin Dan cultivator do that? The sudden appearance of a Jin Dan cultivator had already caused waves in the hearts of the 12 Jin Dan cultivators present. Now that they saw that he was not an ordinary Jin Dan cultivator, their hearts trembled. Yi Jingtu, will the Yi family compensate? Li Daochong floated in the air and asked loudly. His voice was like a tidal wave. Every word he said was accompanied by a wave of sound waves. The cultivators who were standing far away could not avoid the sound waves and were forced to retreat. Yi Jingtu spat out a mouthful of blood. The Jin Dan in his body had cracked open. If he was hit again, he might suffer from an unrecoverable injury. Because the Yi family members were the closest to him, they were all swaying left and right. After being hit by Li Daochong's sound waves, only a few of them could remain standing. You dare to touch the Yi family? Yi Jingta held his breath. Why wouldn't I? Li Daochong's reply was even sharper than before. Puff! More than half of the Yi family cultivators spat out mouthfuls of blood. All of them suffered internal injuries. The 12 Jin Dan cultivators' eyes twitched. Just this move alone was enough to show that Mr. Li's spiritual energy was profound. Just the sound waves alone were enough to render so many cultivators defenseless. Yi Jingtu's face was pale and bloodless. He clutched his chest and could not say a word. Li Daocheng shot a telekinetic attack at him. Yi Jingtu's mind buzzed. The feeling of impending death made him shiver. The higher the cultivation level of a cultivator, the more afraid they were of death. Yi Jingtu could not stand steadily. With a thud, he fell to his knees. He had a splitting headache and could not hold on any longer. Without caring about his reputation, he said, "The Yi family will compensate." After spitting out these 3 words with difficulty, the pressure in Yi Jingtu's mind disappeared. "I will give you 3 hours. If you do not see 10 million spirit stones within 3 hours, I will cripple the cultivation bases of all the cultivators from your Yi family," Li Daocheng said coolly. After that, Li Daocheng slowly landed on the battlefield. He glanced at the cultivators around him and said, "The Yin clan still has 1 more participant. I'll take it." And Monian couldn't believe his ears when he heard this. Everyone in the Yin family looked delighted. And Sinuo and Dingbang looked at each other and smiled. The old man heaved a sigh of relief. Li Daocheng was waiting for a few of the stronger Jindan cultivators to be exhausted. The remaining Jindan cultivators could be wiped out with a wave of his hand. Although Zhou Rong was strong, Li Daocheng had seen the battle between her and Bai Yi, so there was nothing to worry about. "I'm sorry to have kept you waiting." Li Daocheng bowed slightly after landing on the ground. Zhou Rong was stunned by his politeness. "It's fine. Mr. Li, you have reached the Jindan realm at such a young age. I admire you." Zhou Rong's eyes flickered as she nodded slightly. The two of them chatted back and forth, which was quite unique. They didn't look like they were about to fight at all. They were more like young men and women introducing themselves to each other for the first time. Many cultivators with good eyesight even saw a faint blush on Zhou Rong's face. In fact, it wasn't just Zhou Rong. The eyes of the surrounding female cultivators were also shining. To be able to reach the Jindan realm at such a young age, he was definitely tall, rich, and handsome among cultivators. Any female cultivator would be tempted by him and would want to take him for herself. Where else could one find such a dual-day partner? He was a rare breed. Most cultivators who reached the Jindan realm were at least 40 to 50 years old, accounting for 60% of them. The more powerful ones who reached the Jindan realm at around 30 years old were already quite impressive. This young man, who looked like he wasn't even 20 years old, was already a Jindan cultivator. In the entire Federation, he was as rare as phoenix feathers and unicorn horns. Even in the 3 great cultivation empires, there were very few of them. What woman wouldn't be tempted by such a young and promising man? If a mortal woman saw him, she would find that cultivators had a natural attraction to mortals. The stronger the cultivation, the stronger the attraction. Mortals already had a hard time resisting the spiritual energy of a Foundation establishment cultivator, let alone a Jindan cultivator. However, no matter if it was a mortal woman or a mortal man, cultivators wouldn't take a liking to them. This was because mortals had impure energy in their bodies. If they came into close contact with them, they would absorb a portion of the cultivator's spiritual energy, hindering their cultivation. Thus, cultivators wouldn't choose mortals when looking for a partner. Cultivating demonic arts was another matter altogether. Fairy spider lilies left a deep impression. "I've already wasted a lot of time. Fairy, please," Li Daocheng immediately said. "Mr. Li, then I'll have to offend you." Zhou Rong didn't intend to be polite. After she finished speaking, the petals drifted away with the wind. In an instant, the space within a 10-meter radius was filled with petals. "Fairy, this move of yours is useless against me. Just use your ultimate move," Li Daocheng reminded her. "How do you know it's useless if you don't try?" Zhou Rong clearly didn't believe Li Daocheng's words. Li Daocheng shrugged, revealing an expression that said, "Do whatever you want." The number of petals Zhou Rong used right now was more than double the number of petals she used against Bai Yi. Li Daocheng's Tsang ink was riddled with injuries. Naturally, he couldn't use it. Otherwise, he would have been able to break the drifting flower formation with one slash. However, even without the Tsang ink, Li Daocheng still had a way to break it. Although the Straw Hat Cultivator's Samurai was only a low-grade heaven-grade weapon and couldn't withstand more than 2 or 3 slashes from Li Daocheng, it was enough to be used as a single-use weapon. Li Daocheng stretched out his hand, and the samurai sword flew into his hand. A serious expression appeared on Zhou Rong's delicate face. She couldn't see through this Mr. Li at all. She had no idea how strong he was. Zhou Rong's eyes focused. The spirit energy in her body suddenly shrank. Then, with a wave of her delicate hand, thousands of petals flew out. Li Daocheng swung his saber. The 5th stage of the 9-split saber technique, Star Slashing Slash. During the Jin Dan stage, Li Daocheng condensed the Jin Dan. The spirit energy in his body was as boundless as a surging river. When he used a technique like the 9-split saber technique, he could transcend the ordinary category and take another step forward. Before the Jin Dan stage, when Li Daocheng used the 9-split saber technique, he could only focus on one line and exert the power to the extreme. After the Jin Dan stage, the 9-split saber technique's level increased again. In addition to the splitting effect, Li Daocheng's understanding of the saber technique increased by another level. With one slash, he could release and withdraw. When released, he could scatter flowers. When withdrawn, he could break mountains and rivers. Previously, the Star Slashing Slash could only produce one Star Slashing Slash. At this moment, the Star Slashing Slash was still one slash, but it produced thousands of splendors. Each of the splendors hit a petal. Not one slash more, not one slash less. The thousands of petals were all cut down. Zhou Rong hurriedly retreated more than 10 steps. The qi and blood in her body were surging. She felt something sweet in her throat and almost spat out a mouthful of blood, but she forced herself to swallow it back. Li Daocheng didn't move, but the samurai sword in his hand was broken into more than 10 pieces. There wasn't a trace of magic gold left, and it turned into ordinary iron. Li Daocheng swung his hand and threw away the broken samurai sword. Seeing this scene, the cultivators watching from afar all sucked in a breath of cold air. What kind of saber technique was this? That slash carried thousands of splendors, like stars in the night sky. It cut down Zhou Rong's famous consummate skill, the scattered flower formation. Nothing was left. The terrifying part of this saber technique wasn't its power, but its accuracy and attack range. In other words, no matter how many there were, he could cut them all down with one slash. Its power was close to a divine power, but it wasn't a divine power at all. It was just a saber technique. The petal darts fell to the frozen ground one after another, making a series of sounds. Zhou Rong's heart ached. She had spent more than 10 years collecting dozens of magic gold materials to refine these petal darts. Each petal was expensive, but now they were all gone. Even a Jin Dan cultivator like Zhou Rong couldn't bear such a loss. It would take a long time to gather so many more. Li Daocheng shook his head and said, "Fairy, I told you not to use them, but you didn't listen." Zhou Rong's qi and blood hadn't completely calmed down, so she couldn't speak. She could only look at Li Daocheng with a hint of anger in her eyes. This guy is really strong. Zhou Rong sighed and had to admit reality. Zhou Rong had fought countless battles over the years against dark ghosts and cultivators, but she had never been unable to see through her opponent like today. Even when she faced that red ghost, Zhou Rong didn't feel this way. An inexplicable intuition slowly grew in Zhou Rong's heart. Not even the resurrection lily could deal with him. At this moment, miserable screams rang out from the loose cultivators in the distance. A massive black gate rose from the ground and blasted away a dozen or so cultivators. The black gate opened and a human-shaped minotaur monster walked out. It was over 6 meters tall and wielded a massive wolf-tooth club. The moment the minotaur appeared, it launched a frenzied assault on the cultivators in front of it. With a single swing of its club, several cultivators were smashed into meat paste. In just 2 or 3 swings of the club, more than half of the loose cultivators were wiped out. Only 4 Jin Dan cultivators managed to dodge. When Wang Qianxi saw the Minotaur, he didn't hesitate in the slightest. He turned and charged into the sky. He was the first to flee. At a glance, Wang Qianxi recognized that the Minotaur that walked out of the black door was a general-level ghost beast of the Nether Realm. Even a Jindan stage cultivator was no match for it. Its strength was comparable to a peak Jindan stage cultivator, and its physical defense could withstand several attacks from a nascent soul stage cultivator. This was one of the Hades' heavy ground tanks. Wang Qianxi had been to 13 Spectre before. The Minotaur was the nightmare of the Jindan cultivators on 13 Spectre. Wang Qianxi reflexively retreated several li away. Just as Wang Qianxi breathed a sigh of relief, thinking that he had escaped disaster, a wave of dark fire rushed toward him. Wang Qianxi was shocked and did his best to block, but his moves were instantly annihilated. He was swallowed up by the dark fire and turned into black dust. Chapter 415. Wang Qianxi was not the only one who was burned to death by the Oxhead's attack. Chun Yuan, the faceless Taoist, was too exhausted from the previous battle and was unable to dodge. He was also buried in the sea of fire. Lu Jingtian, the enlightened Taoist, used all his strength to barely survive. One of his arms was burned to ashes. Among the 4 rogue cultivators, the only one who managed to dodge was Old Man Green Bamboo, Zhang Shou. 2 of the 4 rogue cultivators from Jindan died in an instant. The cultivators present were all terrified. How could a terrifying general-level ghost beast like the Oxhead appear on planet Crimson Sun? Quick, inform the cultivation army. Someone shouted. The appearance of a ghost beast of this level was enough to turn a 4th-class cultivation planet like planet Crimson Sun into a dead planet. Many cultivators were shocked. Many of them started to use their wristwatches to contact the local cultivation army on planet Crimson Sunday. Just as the cultivators were flustered, the wristwatches in their hands flashed with sparks and exploded. Everyone's spirit magnetic wristwatches were destroyed. A few cultivators were very smart. When they saw that their spirit magnetic wristwatches were damaged, they immediately took out high-level 1,000-mile voice transmission talismans and released them. However, the talismans did not turn into spirit magnetic sound waves. Instead, they were burned to ashes the moment they left their hands. Only then did the cultivators realize that something was wrong. After the Oxhead appeared, a magnetic barrier rose within a radius of dozens of kilometers, isolating this place from the outside world. Many cultivators began to flee. Even the Jindan cultivators could not withstand the Oxhead's attack, let alone them. However, the cultivators did not run far before they returned. A few kilometers away, the black fog lingered. Once they entered, they would be devoured by the death aura and turned into dried corpses. However, the black fog that suddenly appeared did not spread. It only enveloped this area completely. At this moment, Yi Zhengtu and Dong Yuan's faces were filled with fear. "Brother Yi, what's with the black fog?" Dong Yuan asked through telekinesis. However, there was a hint of panic in his voice. Yi Zhengtu's face was pale. He was badly injured by Li Daocheng's telekinesis attack. He looked at the black fog in the distance with a confused expression. "Brother Dong, something's wrong. This Oxhead has already condensed a death beast core. It's a complete body. We can't control it." Yi Zhengtu's voice changed. This. Dong Yuan was so scared that he could not speak. This Oxhead was released by Yi Zhengtu and Dong Yuan. Jin and a dozen Jindan cultivators gathered to surround this young Oxhead. 3 Jindan cultivators. And was killed. 2 Suppressed. And after they had killed 3 of them and killed 4 seriously injured. And heavily injured killed to kill 2 of the 2 killed they. Of addition, the Lingxi Pagoda was a type of spatial Dharma treasure. There was a Nayu space inside, which was equivalent to an independent small universe. It was about the size of a city. This S. Without a nascent soul realm cultivator, It was impossible to kill a general-level ghost beast like the Oxhead. With the offensive attack of a Jindan realm cultivator, even if they bombarded it day and night and stabbed it with sabers and swords for a few days and nights, they still could not kill it. The only way to kill it was to seal it in a space. After sealing the Oxhead, the next step was to bring it to the demon-subduing city guarded by the cultivation army on 13 Spectre to exchange for items. At that time, Yijing too and the others did the same. A single Oxhead was worth a lot. It was enough for more than a dozen people to get something they wanted. However, on the way back, they encountered a ghost beast tide. A group of Jindan cultivators fought desperately. In the end, only Yijing Tu and Dong Yuan survived. The two of them plundered all the items on the bodies of the fallen Jindan cultivators. Among them, there was a very special Dharma treasure. It was the tortoise breath box. This Dharma treasure had a very simple use. It was to conceal all auras. Anything placed inside would disappear as if it had disappeared. This turtle breath box was a little special. There was a spatial spirit array on it that could perform spatial jumps. With this thing, Yijing Tu became greedy and wanted to bring the Oxhead out of 13 Spectre. When Dong Yuan heard Yijing Tu's idea, he was shocked. Dong Yuan did not agree at first. It was too risky. If they were found out, it would be a serious crime in the Federation. However, when Yijing Tu mentioned the Black Prison, Dong Yuan was also tempted. If he handed the Oxhead to the cultivation army on 13 Spectre, he could exchange it for a lot of tempting items. However, if he took it to the Black Prison auction, he could get more than 3 times the exchange value. The black market had always been the craziest and most profitable. In the end, Dong Yuan agreed to take the risk and put the Lingxi Pagoda into the turtle breath box. Then, the two of them directly teleported the turtle breath box out of 13 Spectre and spent 300,000 spirit stones to send it to a dead planet in the 8-ring starfield. It was absolutely impossible to bring it with them. There was the Federation's most powerful detection spirit array in demon-subduing city. Any netherworld item could only enter and not come out. If someone secretly brought a netherworld item out of demon-subduing city, the spirit array would automatically lock onto them and trap them in place. Then, patrolling cultivators would take them away. The netherworld items on 13 Spectre were all very high level. Once they were brought into the 4-ring starfield of the Federation, it would be a disaster. High-level netherworld items could absorb a large amount of soul power and vitality in a very short period of time, allowing themselves to evolve into an even more terrifying existence. However, this time, Yijing Tu and Dong Yuan's risk was successful. The two of them secretly brought the Oxhead out of 13 Spectre. Then, they found a turtle breath box with a mark on the dead planet and brought it to planet Crimson Sunday. In the blink of an eye, more than 10 years had passed. During this time, Dong Yuan had looked for Yijing Tu and wanted to go to the Black Prison to sell the Oxhead. However, Yijing Tu was greedy. He felt that the value of a young Oxhead was far from enough. Only an adult Oxhead could be sold for a high price. Ever since Yijing Tu returned, he had been feeding the Oxhead. What did he use to feed it? Was there need to ask? Of course, it was a human soul. On a bustling 4th-class cultivation planet, finding homeless people and lonely people was as easy as flipping one's hand. In the past 10 years, at least tens of thousands of people on planet Crimson Sun had disappeared, and it was related to Yijing Tu. Tens of thousands of people seemed to be a large number, but to a cultivation planet with more than 3 billion people, it was just a drop in the ocean. Moreover, many of these people were vagrants without families, so no one would pay attention to them. Every once in a while, Yijing Tu would go to some of the big cities on planet Crimson Sun to capture people and throw them into the Lingxi Tower. However, feeding the Oxhead was one thing. Yijing Tu could not find out the specific situation of the Oxhead unless he released it. Otherwise, with his telekinesis, he could not penetrate space and investigate the situation in the Universe space. He could only make a rough judgment. Yijing Tu had stopped feeding the Oxhead 3 years ago. He estimated that the Oxhead had almost reached adulthood. However, Yijing Tu did not know what abilities an adult Oxhead had. General-level ghost beasts already had the ability to use dark arts. This was the same principle that Jin Dan cultivators had the ability to use divine abilities. Yijing Tu was only an early-stage Jin Dan cultivator. He had only been to the 13 Spectre once. At that time, he had gathered more than 10 Jin Dan cultivators, but they had only been circling the outermost area of the hunting ground. Therefore, Yijing Tu's understanding of the ox head was limited to other sources. He had never seen it with his own eyes. Now that he had released the ox head, Yijing Tu realized that he had been completely wrong. In the past 3 years, he and Dong Yuan had secretly collected many secret techniques to control ghost beasts. Some of them could control general-level ghost beasts. However, Yijing Tu had neglected his own cultivation level. Even if he and Dong Yuan had mastered the secret techniques, they would not be able to control ghost beasts like the ox head. Their telekinesis was not enough to interfere with the ox head's dark soul. Yijing Tu's back was drenched in cold sweat. The ox head was running wildly in the direction of the 3 great family clans. The ox head's eyes, which are the size of copper gongs, were filled with red light. It had been sealed for more than 10 years. Once the suppressed anger was released, it would be extremely terrifying. The ox head's eyes were fixed on Yijing Tu and Dong Yuan. Even if the 2 of them were reduced to ashes, it would never forget the 2 of them who had sealed it away. Yijing Tu suddenly understood the meaning of these words. The arrival of death and the heavy injuries caused him to stand motionless on the spot like a statue. Smack! The ox head stomped down with its hooves, and Yijing Tu turned into a pile of meat paste. Patriarch! The Yi family members cried out. They could not believe what they had just seen. Although Dong Yuan was afraid, his injuries were much better than Yijing Tu's. At this moment, he had already flown out and fled to where the family members were. Mr. Li, shouldn't we put aside the fight between us for a while? If we don't get rid of this beast, everyone here will die under its iron hooves. Do you want to join forces? Zhou Rong suddenly asked. Chapter 416. Li Daochong naturally knew of Oxhead's illustrious reputation as a demonic beast of the Hades. Oxhead and Horseface had an extremely high reputation among the large group of mortals. There was almost no one who didn't know of them. When grandpas and grandmas scared children, they would often tell them to be obedient, and not be naughty. Otherwise, Oxhead and Horseface would spank their little buttocks and take the naughty children away. The old people's playful words to scare children revealed the reverence and fear of Oxhead and Horseface among the mortals. 1,000 years ago, when the Hades descended, the highest level of demonic beasts that mortals could see were Oxhead and Horseface. When Li Daochong had just woken up, he had already read through all the ancient records in the library of Profound Firmament University. At that time, Li Daochong didn't have the ability to remember everything he saw. However, with the assistance of the hot-blooded level-up device, he was able to remember most of the things he saw. Some records regarding Oxhead surfaced in his mind at this time. Oxhead was originally a member of the Demon Ox clan, belonging to the nobility of the demonic beasts. The demonic beasts were unable to resist the invasion of the Hades, and were almost exterminated. The demonic beasts still had their bestial nature, making them easier to control than the humans. Although the Demon Ox clan was a fighting clan among the demonic beasts, they were easily controlled because of their tyrannical nature, quick to anger, and reckless nature. The Hades only needed to use the fog of death to completely exterminate the Demon Ox clan. All the Demon Ox clan's demon cores turned into death-seeking pills, becoming members of the Hades. This was the origin of Oxhead. After Oxhead became a demonic beast, his strength was actually a level higher than before, reaching the peak of Jindan and even half a step into Yuanying's level. He could be considered the backbone of the Hades. In reality, the consciousness of the Demon Ox clan was not completely dissolved by the fog of death. They were one of the few demonic beasts that still had their consciousness, but were still willing to become demonic beasts. The demonic beasts cultivated slowly. How could they be so relaxed and happy after becoming demonic beasts? They only needed to devour the vitality of souls to rapidly increase their cultivation. Moreover, when it devoured the life force of the soul, it would produce an extremely great sense of pleasure. It was a kind of comfort that came from the depths of the soul. It was like eating immortal grass, causing one to be fascinated and unable to stop even if they wanted to. After Oxhead stomped Yi Jingtu to death with one hoof, he smashed more than half of the Yi clan members to death with a few blows. Under the pressure of the dense death chi, these cultivators, who were not Oxhead's match to begin with, could not fight back at all. Oxhead crushed everything in front of him like he was killing a chicken. Following which, Oxhead turned around and raised his iron hooves. Thump, thump, thump. With heavy footsteps, he charged towards Dong Yuan at an astonishing speed. At this moment, Dong Yuan was already standing among the infamily. Anmonian's expression darkened. Dong Yuan, what's the meaning of this? Dong Yuan gritted his teeth shamelessly and said, Anmonian, you're going to die either way. Isn't the infamily going to fight? Anmonian scoffed. Even if I do, I won't be your shield. As soon as he finished speaking, the old man, surnamed Mu, who had always been standing beside Anmonian, suddenly waved his hand. A ray of light suddenly appeared and enveloped everyone in the infamily, except for Dong Yuan. In the blink of an eye, everyone disappeared, leaving only Dong Yuan standing alone in his original spot. Teleport with so many people at once? Dong Yuan was dumbfounded. Even if he was in peak condition, he would not be able to do it. Without a late-stage Jin Dan cultivation, he would not be able to use this kind of divine power. The infamily members did not leave the area surrounded by the black fog. They merely shifted their positions and appeared in another location several kilometers away. Old Man Mu's face was pale. That move just now had taken a lot out of him. However, it completely ruined Dong Yuan's wishful thinking of using the infamily members to block Oxhead's attack. When Dong Yuan saw where the infamily members appeared, he still wanted to leap over. However, he had just taken flight when a furry beast reached out and grabbed him. Dong Yuan screamed in pain. His bones had already been crushed. Oxhead opened his mouth and bit off Dong Yuan's head. He then split the rest of his body into 3 bites and swallowed it. The spiritual body, Jin Dan, and powerful soul of a Jin Dan cultivator were great nourishment for Oxhead. After eating Dong Yuan, the death aura on Oxhead's body became denser. A dark red underworld fire burned in its eyes. Different types of underworld fire had different colors. Dark red and black were the most common colors of underworld fire. After Oxhead absorbed Dong Yuan's life force, it raised its head to the sky. Its body trembled slightly, revealing an expression of enjoyment. He looked exactly like a drug addict when he was taking drugs. The effect lasted for more than 10 seconds. During the entire process, Oxhead enjoyed the most direct stimulation in the depths of its dead soul. It was not worried at all whether the ants around it would attack it or not, nor was it worried that they would escape. After Oxhead finished absorbing the life force in its body, it slowly lowered its head and looked at the group of cultivators in the distance. Tonight was going to be a grand banquet. Oxhead let out a low roar of excitement from the depths of its throat. Devouring so many cultivators was enough for it to advance into an Oxhead shaman. Oxhead shamans were no longer ghost beasts, but underworld beasts. This was a creature of the Hades that was far above ghost beasts. After Li Daochong and Zhou Rong came to an agreement, they did not immediately take action. Instead, they stood motionless in their original position and watched as Oxhead wiped out all the cultivators with stronger cultivation from the 3 great clans. Oxhead cleaned up quite thoroughly. No matter if it was cultivators, or mortal servants from the 3 great clans, as long as they could reach them, they were all eaten clean. Among them, there were 5 Jin Dan cultivators. The remaining survivors were all small chi condensation cultivators, criminals, Jiuhui Xing, Sita Fong, Cha. This feast was enough to make Oxhead's power of dead souls increase by leaps and bounds. However, for some reason, Oxhead's death aura did not increase by much. Apart from Li Daochong, no one else knew why. In fact, most people did not even realize this problem. Only the remaining Jean Dan cultivators revealed puzzlement in their eyes. Logically speaking, the 5 Jean Dan cultivators being swallowed by Ox Head should be enough to make this beast's death aura increase by an entire level. Even if it could not advance, it would definitely make its strength increase greatly. However, after the Ox Head ate everyone from the 3 great clans, the increase in its death aura was very limited. This was somewhat strange. Zhou Rong frowned slightly, somewhat unable to understand. Suddenly, she sensed an obscure but extremely condensed force of will. Then, Zhou Rong's brows relaxed, and she revealed an expression of surprise. She turned to look at Li Daochong beside her and asked, "Mr. Li, were you the one who killed those Jean Dan cultivators first?" Li Daochong stared unblinkingly at the ox head in front of him. After hearing Zhou Rong's question, he nodded slightly and replied without any intention of hiding anything. "If I did not kill the Jean Dan cultivators first and destroy their souls, causing the spirit chi of Jean Dan to quickly overflow and become deficient, this ox head would not be so powerful after swallowing so many Jean Dan cultivators. Fairy would not want to face an ox head that you can't defeat, right?" After hearing Li Daochong's words, Zhou Rong felt a chill run down her spine for no reason, and her hair stood on end. This Mr. Li's thoughts were frighteningly meticulous. Just as everyone was scared silly by the ox head and their minds were in a mess, he had actually thought of killing those Jean Dan cultivators before the ox head did. After all, the ox head had only swallowed dead people. Although the cultivators who had just died still had a large amount of life force, compared to those who were still alive, the difference was like heaven and earth. Furthermore, Li Daochong's method of killing these Jean Dan cultivators was a telekinesis attack. He had directly destroyed their souls and instantly left their bodies with only skin left. Meticulous thoughts and terrifying spiritual force. Zhou Rong suddenly realized that she might have been too close to this Mr. Li. After reaching an agreement to join forces, Zhou Rong let down her guard and walked to Li Daochong's side. Only then did she realize how brainless and ignorant her actions were. He had killed 5 early-stage Jean Dan cultivators from the 3 great clans with his spiritual force alone. The strength of this fellow's spiritual force had already surpassed that of a late-stage Jean Dan cultivator. The 3 great clans were quickly cleaned up. The ox head was clearly not satisfied and turned his attention to the infamily. The 3 great clans that had been fighting over the Frost Soul Origin Crystal had almost been completely wiped out. The itinerant cultivators had suffered heavy losses and were only left with half of their original cultivators. The infamily was the best preserved. After resting for a while, Old Gun and Bai Yi had recovered some strength. At this moment, the 2 of them stood up and were in a state of alert. The ox head turned his face to look at the infamily and let out a terrifying roar. He stepped on his iron hooves and charged forward, waving the huge mace in his hand. The infamily members were shocked. This ghost beast was too strong and could not be defeated. Just when the infamily members thought that they were going to be eaten by the ox head tonight, a green light flashed. A huge fist formed by Spiritual Highland hit the ox head's cheek hard. Bang! The ox head's huge body flew sideways as if it had been hit by a huge boulder. It slid more than 10 meters in the air and fell heavily to the ground. The moment the ox head appeared, it was immune to all the attacks of the cultivators who attacked it. The impression it left on everyone was that it was invincible. Therefore, when the ox head was sent flying, everyone was stunned and stood there in a daze. They could not believe what they had seen was true. Li Daochong's punch was just a small test of his skills. The power of the fist of rupturing had indeed increased a lot. After Li Daochong landed, the infamily members looked at him as if they were looking at a statue. Their eyes were full of awe. Even the siblings, Ding Anding and Anshino, who had been friends with Li Daochong, could not help but look up to him. The only thought in their minds was that they were not from the same world. Chapter 417. Oxhead stood up and shook his head. He looked a little dizzy, but he quickly recovered. 2 puffs of hot air came out of his plate-sized nostrils. He looked at Li Daochong with bloodshot eyes and roared angrily. Then he swung the mace in his hand and smashed it at Li Daochong. Li Daochong stood where he was and looked at Oxhead playfully, wondering what kind of move he should use to deal with it. Heavenly Thunder spell or Spirit Talisman? Or should he continue to use the Rupturing Fist? The family members standing behind Li Daochong were all shocked, and Sinuo even shouted, "Mr. Li, be careful." Li Daochong, on the other hand, looked at Insinuo and smiled at her. As for Oxhead, who was charging at him at this moment, and the huge mace that was smashing down from the sky, he didn't care at all. The family members' hearts were about to jump out of their throats. Old Gun and Bai Yi, the two Jindan cultivators, were a little surprised. They didn't know what Li Daochong was up to. Just as the huge mace was about to smash down, a pinkish gold brilliance suddenly flashed. The red spider lily spun at high speed. Bang! The mace smashed on the huge petals of the red spider lily, making a deafening sound. Oxhead's body shook violently. His huge body was fixed in place, and cracks appeared on the mace. Black clouds overflowed from the stamen of the red spider lily and nibbled at Oxhead bit by bit. Every time they merged, the death chi on Oxhead's body would decrease. Li Daochong touched his chin and watched this scene. Fairy Zhou Rong's magical power also had a restraining effect on the underworld. The desperate expressions of the surrounding cultivators gradually eased. They thought they were going to die, but when they saw Oxhead restrained by the red spider lily, they all saw hope. Zhou Rong is so strong. Even Oxhead can't withstand her red spider lily soul attraction. A cultivator couldn't help but sigh. Zhou Rong is really condescending to stay on planet Red Sunday. Just when the cultivators thought that Zhou Rong could defeat Oxhead with this move, the beast suddenly moved. Oxhead raised his head and roared. His body, which was already huge, swelled up even more. The dark muscles on his body bulged. Oxhead's current state was a bit similar to the transformed state of the Blood Ape King that Li Daochong had fought not long ago. However, Oxhead's size didn't increase to an exaggerated extent, just a little. Oxhead's body shook, and the black clouds released by the red spider lily were actually shaken to the point that they overflowed. Oxhead fiercely swung the cracked spike club in his hand. With a bang, the Permetha flower's rotating flower wheel was sent flying by the heavy blow. The mace was completely shattered and fell to the ground. Puff! Zhou Rong spat out a mouthful of blood and almost fell to the ground. "Mr. Li, I'm sorry. This is all I can do." Zhou Rong did not forget to send a telepathic message to Li Daochong. Li Daochong grinned and didn't reply. He only made a gesture in Zhou Rong's direction to express his thanks. Then, Li Daochong leaped up and flew into the night sky. He floated more than 30 meters above the ground and looked down at Oxhead, who seemed to have gone crazy. After killing Oxhead, I should be able to obtain a lot of soul power. I might even be able to enter the mid-stage of Jindan. So, there's no need to hold back. The Frost Soul Origin Crystal is about to appear. I don't have time to play with a beast like you, Li Daochong said softly to himself. As he spoke, a circle of blue-gold sparks flashed in his eyes. Then his eyes were filled with blue-gold light and shot out 2 dazzling rays of light. Oxhead was burning with anger. He stomped on the ground with his iron hooves. With a bang, the ground exploded and a crater appeared. Oxhead soared into the sky and opened his mouth, spitting out a ball of black flames. "It's the nether fire. Mr. Li, be careful. Dodge it." And Ding Bang cried out. The other cultivators' hearts tightened. Whether or not Li Daochong and Zhou Rong could defeat Oxhead would determine the fate of everyone present. If Li Daochong and Zhou Rong won, everyone would escape from death. If they lost, everyone would become Oxhead's food. When they saw Oxhead spitting out Hades of flames towards Li Daochong, everyone held their breaths. They had just witnessed the power of the nether fire. Out of the 4 Jindan cultivators, 2 were instantly killed, 1 was severely injured, and only 1 managed to escape. Green Bamboo Elder Zhang Shou and Taoist Kongming Lu Jingtian, who had just experienced the power of the nether fire, looked regretful. Zhang Shou shook his head. "We can't dodge it." Lu Jingtian looked anxious. Brother Zhang, do we need help? Zhang Shou sighed. It's too late. Oxhead's nether fire had split into 4 balls and could still kill Gene Dan cultivators. Now that it had completely condensed into one, its power had increased by 4 times. It could even burn a late-stage Gene Dan cultivator to death, let alone an early-stage Gene Dan cultivator. Meanwhile, the young Mr. Li had no intention of dodging. No one knew if it was because he couldn't or because he was blindly confident. In any case, he hovered in the air motionlessly, allowing the nether fire to burn him. The nether fire instantly engulfed Li Daochong. Sighs came from all around, and Sinuo couldn't believe what he saw. Mr. Li, who looked like he had the help of God, was burned to death by the nether fire? Was this a lie? And Ding Bang sat in his hover wheelchair, his expression frozen and his mind in a mess. And Monian felt like he was on a jump machine. He had just climbed to the top and saw hope, but now he fell to the bottom like he was jumping off a building. His heart felt like it had stopped beating. A hint of regret appeared on Bai Yi's fair and delicate face. Such a monster died, just like that? It was really a pity. Zhou Rong clutched her chest and also looked regretful. However, she immediately stretched out her hand, and the pinkish gold spider lily appeared in her hand. Zhou Rong's eyes were filled with determination. She had no choice but to use that move. The red spider lily's soul guidance was the limit of Zhou Rong's current mastery. The road to the underworld mantra was a mysterious cultivation technique Zhou Rong obtained during her travels. The red spider lily's soul guidance was the first of the 3 ultimate moves. It took Zhou Rong 10 years to master it, and she had only just started cultivating the second move. The red spider lily's river of forgetfulness. Zhou Rong's eyes narrowed. Just as she was about to make a move, a muffled thunder suddenly sounded in the air. She looked up. In the air where the nether fire engulfed Mr. Li, lightning flashed in the ball of nether fire that was burning vigorously. The nether fire didn't seem to be fire anymore, but a black cloud wrapped in lightning. The cultivators didn't know what was going on, and they all had strange looks in their eyes. Boom! Another clap of thunder sounded. Clang! The lightning flashed more and more fiercely. In a short while, the nether fire was devoured. The black flames disappeared, and Mr. Li, who was wrapped in lightning, was still floating in the air, unharmed. Li Daochong's eyes turned into 2 rays of bluish gold light. The terrifying lightning power in his eyes kept condensing. The oxhead was charging at him with its mouth wide open, ready to bite down. However, the moment the nether fire disappeared, the oxhead's hair shivered. It looked at Li Daochong in fear. Li Daochong's lips curled up. Heavenly thunder technique. Eye of thunder punishment. Boom! 2 bolts of lightning shot out from Li Daochong's eyes. Moo! The oxhead let out a terrified cry. This cry reverted to its most primitive sound, and it was no different from an ox. The oxhead's soul was trembling. Its fear of yang thunder was innate. The oxhead wanted to escape, but it was too late. Even if it did its best to stimulate all the power of the dead souls, it forcefully spat out a mouthful of black blood and used the Stygian blood escape to escape. Once the Stygian blood escape was used, its speed could reach a terrifying speed of several miles per second. However, compared to the speed of the lightning, this was just child's play. The dark night sky was illuminated by the 2 bolts of lightning. A huge oxhead's body was penetrated by the 2 bolts of lightning. The oxhead only had time to let out a primitive cry before it was turned into charcoal. Even the death pill was shattered into powder. The 2 bolts of lightning pierced through the oxhead's body and struck the ground like missiles. With a boom, a huge hole with a diameter of more than 1 mile appeared in the ground. It was so deep that one couldn't see how deep it was. The ground seemed to have been penetrated. Li Daochong wanted to take out the death pill to sell. However, he didn't expect that he would use too much force and turn the oxhead into ashes. There wasn't a single spot on the oxhead's body that was intact. As the night wind blew, the oxhead turned into black ashes and disappeared. The surrounding black fog also disappeared. Li Daochong fell from the sky with a look of pity. He muttered, "Damn it, I used too much force." The surroundings were silent. All the cultivators stared blankly at Li Daocheng with their eyes wide open. Their hearts were already in turmoil. Was he still AF Astra's king human? Not only did he become a Jin Dan cultivator at such a young age, but he could also release such terrifying spirit sun lightning. Even a peak Jin Dan cultivator might not be able to withstand that attack, unless it was Yuanying. Looking at the huge, bottomless hole, everyone felt a chill run down their spines. Fortunately, the location of this attack was relatively far from the grotto. Otherwise, the Frost Soul Origin Crystal would have been bombarded into ashes. Dad, is this the same Mr. Li we met on the Blue Bay Star? And Sino stuttered. In his mind, he recalled the first time he met Li Daocheng more than a year ago at the Zixiao People's Hospital on the Blue Bay Star. When the image of Li Daocheng in his memory overlapped with the image of Li Daocheng at this moment, and Shino couldn't tell if they were still the same person. Chapter 4:18. Beep. Killed 1 ox head. Obtained soul power. Host has leveled up to level 21. After Li Daocheng used the Eye of Thunder punishment, the spirit energy in his body was almost depleted. This was the first time he was facing a general-level ghost beast like Oxhead. Li Daocheng didn't dare to be careless. He would go all out if he didn't attack. Li Daocheng didn't hold back in this attack. The 2 bolts of thunder punishment gathered all of Li Daocheng's strength. Therefore, its power was extremely shocking. Just as the other cultivators had guessed, ordinary peak Jin Dan cultivators couldn't withstand it. Only a nascent soul cultivator would be able to withstand Li Daocheng's Eye of Thunder punishment, which was unleashed with all his might. This move was Li Daocheng's most powerful trump card so far. At the same time, it had an additional effect on the dark ghosts. Otherwise, Oxhead wouldn't have been killed. However, once Oxhead died, a black mist was immediately sucked into Li Daocheng's body and disappeared. Li Daocheng, who was almost depleted, instantly replenished the spirit energy in his body. The Jin Dan grew slightly. Without much effort, Li Daocheng stepped into the middle stage of Jin Dan. According to the level calculation of the hot-blooded level-up tool, he was level 21. Li Daocheng had only estimated that he might level up. When he really leveled up, he was somewhat surprised. Of course, he was more delighted. The spirit energy in his body increased by an entire level once again. The Jin Dan condensed even more, and the Yuanying spirit embryo in the core began to take shape. Jin Dan's breakthrough to Yuanying was the process of the Jin Dan hatching the primordial soul spirit infant. Countless cultivators were stuck at this stage, unable to advance even an inch. They didn't understand the main point until the day they died. However, for Li Daocheng, there was no bottleneck at all. He only needed to kill enough ghosts. No one noticed the changes in Li Daocheng's body, and they couldn't. With Li Daocheng's current strength, not to mention a few Jin Dan cultivators, even if a Yuanying cultivator really came, he would still be able to match them. Of course, after these days of continuous fighting, Li Daocheng's equipment consumption was astonishing. Song Ink was riddled with injuries. If it did not level up, it would not be able to use it for the time being. Li Daocheng had used up all of his talismans. Not a single one was left. The materials for making talismans were also not very complete. Other than money and spirit stones, Li Daocheng had nothing on him. Fortunately, Li Daocheng had never been particularly reliant on equipment. However, as his cultivation base increased, Li Daocheng increasingly felt the importance of equipment. This was the first time that Li Daocheng had fought without Song Ink in a situation where the opponent was not very strong. Li Daocheng still felt that something was missing, and his heart was not at ease. After everything here was settled, the first thing that Li Daocheng wanted to do was to go to the North Star University's weapon refining school to find someone to repair and upgrade Song Ink. Li Daocheng used a shocking sacred art to kill Oxhead in front of everyone. None of the cultivators present dared to say anything. His overwhelming strength silenced everyone. The 3 big clans only had a few weak mortals left. When they saw the black clouds dissipate, they immediately wanted to leave. The Yi clan's patriarch, Yi Xiao, escaped because his cultivation base was not high. Oxhead's targets were mainly cultivators with high cultivation bases. Yi Xiao brought the few remaining Yi clan members and hurriedly disappeared into the darkness under the cover of the night. Yi Xiao's face was gloomy. What frost, soul, origin crystal? What number 1 cultivator of the Crimson Sun planet? He had no interest in any of that. He only wanted to bring the remaining members of his clan and leave this damned place. The Yi clan had lost too much in this operation. They were almost wiped out. All the powerful cultivators in the clan were killed. Even the patriarch, Yi Jingtu, was killed. The Yi clan could not stay on the Crimson Sun planet any longer. They could only sell all their assets and start anew somewhere else. Just as Yi Xiao was thinking about how to leave the Crimson Sun planet as soon as possible, a faint voice came from behind him. Patriarch Yi, you still have 2.5 hours to prepare 10 million spiritual stones. All right, before I get the stones, you better not leave my sight. Otherwise, I will be very anxious. Once I am anxious, I will be very angry. Once I am angry, I will be very impulsive. Once I am impulsive, I will do some crazy things. For example, I will summon lightning to kill Oxhead and create a crater. What would happen if it landed on the Yi clan's headquarters? Patriarchy, I think you don't want to see me do crazy things, right? Every time Yi Xiao heard a word, the sweat on his body would unconsciously flow out a little. After hearing the entire sentence, Yi Xiao was like a drenched chicken, cold sweat uncontrollably pouring out. It was Mr. Li's voice. Yi Xiao was first frightened. A Jindan cultivator who could kill Oxhead in seconds was not someone the Yi clan could afford to offend. He could easily crush the Yi clan. Yi Xiao was also shocked. After going through the gates of hell, he had long forgotten about the 10 million spiritual stones. Now that it was mentioned, it was already a miracle that Yi Xiao was not paralyzed with fear. Yi Xiao did not dare to take another step. Trembling, he turned around and looked at Li Daochong, who had appeared 3 to 4 meters behind him. Mr. Li, you can rest assured. Since the patriarch has agreed, even if he dies, the Yi clan will follow through. Yi Xiao stuttered. When the cultivators beside him heard this, they were amused. You dare to go back on your word if you don't follow through? Do you want to die? Li Daochong did not say anything else. In a flash, he disappeared from where he was. Li Daochong naturally did not care about the other members of the 3 major clans. They could go wherever they wanted, as long as they did not stay here and be an eyesore. On the side of the rogue cultivators, 2 Jindan cultivators died. One was seriously injured, and only the old Zhongsho was left. The rest of the cultivators also silently left. Other than Zhou Rong, the other cultivators also left. With Mr. Li's terrifying power, who could compete with the Yin clan? Although the treasure was good, it was not as important as their lives. When Zhongsho left, his eyes were filled with unwillingness, but there was nothing he could do. Not to mention Mr. Li, Old Pao, and Bai Yi seemed to have recovered. With the 3 of them together, who would dare to stop them? Even the local self-cultivator army would not be able to stop them. After Li Daochong warned Yi Xiao, he came to the front of the cave. The cold air inside was even colder than before. The Frost Soul Source crystal had completely appeared. It was time to take it. Li Daochong walked into the cave alone. No one dared to follow him. Even Old Gun and Bai Yi did not dare to move after looking at each other. No one knew what kind of temper Mr. Li had. A self-cultivator of this level was probably not easy to talk to. Therefore, it was best not to provoke him. If they followed and angered Mr. Li, he could kill them with a thought. The loss would outweigh the gain. No one wanted to take the risk. Everyone tacitly watched Mr. Li walk into the cave. A few seconds later, Zhou Rong clutched her chest and ignored the strange looks from all around her. She staggered into the cave. After Zhou Rong, no one dared to move. In the cave, Li Daochong quickly walked to the end. This was the place where Li Daochong used the extreme Yin compass to seal the spatial rift a few months ago. The spatial fluctuations here had completely stabilized. There would be no more spatial rifts. However, the cold air was extremely strong. It was colder than any place Li Daochong had ever been. 100 meters underground was the source of the cold air. Li Daocheng reached out his hand. A cyclone formed in his palm and formed a drill. The ground in front of Li Daocheng was quickly drilled open. At this moment, footsteps came from behind him. "Fairy Zhou, you've got guts. How dare you follow me in? Aren't you afraid that I'll kill you?" Li Daocheng said as he drilled the hole. "Mr. Li, I don't mean you any harm. I don't want to compete with you for the Frost Soul Source Crystal. I just want to take a look and ask Mr. Li if you can give me some Frost Soul Source Crystals," Zhou Rong said in a weak voice. Zhou Rong had been badly shaken by the bull's head. She had not recovered yet. Her body was sore all over. There was still some death chi in her body. The general-level ghost beast deserved its reputation. Zhou Rong knew how strong the bull's head was. However, Mr. Li was even stronger. Because the battle had ended so quickly, it was easy to give people the illusion that the bull's head was not very strong. After Zhou Rong finished speaking, the grotto fell into silence. Li Daocheng did not reply. His attention was focused on drilling the hole. The hole was about 2 meters in diameter. Because of the extreme cold air, the entire ground had turned into frozen soil. It was not easy to drill the hole. Even though Li Daocheng was already in the middle stage of the core formation stage, without any ancillary magical equipment, it would still take him a long time to drill a hole 100 meters deep with only the intense swirls generated by his aura. Zhou Rong waited for a while. Seeing that Mr. Li still did not reply, she took out the pink and gold-red spider lily from her sleeve. Normally, it was a normal-sized metal flower. Mr. Li used this. Zhou Rong handed the flower to Li Daocheng. Li Daocheng did not stand on ceremony. He glanced at Zhou Rong, took the red spider lily, and activated it with his spirit chi. The red spider lily grew instantly. It spun at high speed and plunged into the ground. With the Dharma treasure, the speed of drilling the hole increased sharply. In a short while, Li Daocheng had drilled a hole 100 meters deep. The Frost Soul Origin crystal below emitted a sparkling light. Li Daocheng returned the red spider lily wheel to Zhou Rong. The latter looked at Li Daocheng in surprise. Zhou Rong knew her Dharma treasure very well. Not everyone could activate the red spider lily. Although Zhou Rong had not refined the red spider lily into her natal Dharma treasure, most cultivators rejected this kind of extreme inattribute Dharma treasure. It would be awkward to activate and difficult to control. However, in Mr. Li's hands, the red spider lily was a walk in the park. It was quite easy to use. Li Daocheng did not care about Zhou Rong's expression and thoughts. He stared at the Frost Soul Origin crystal below. He reached out his hand, and a soft suction force went deep into the hole. The Frost Soul Origin crystal the size of a water tank slowly rose up. When the Frost Soul Origin crystal floated up from the hole, Zhou Rong's beautiful eyes widened in disbelief. She knew that the Frost Soul Origin crystal on the Red Sun planet was not small, but who would have thought that it would be so big? According to the records, most of the Frost Soul Origin crystals found were only the size of a fist. It could be one piece or several pieces. The largest piece was the size of a normal person's head. The size of a water tank was unprecedented. Li Daocheng put down the Frost Soul Origin crystal slowly, broke a piece, and threw it to Zhou Rong. "Here you are. Consider it the rent for using your Dharma treasure." Zhou Rong's face was full of confusion. She held the Frost Soul Origin crystal, which was the size of 2 palms, in her hands. She never thought that Mr. Li would give her a piece for free. Zhou Rong had gone through a lot to reach the Jindan level. She was used to the dark side of self-cultivators who would do anything for treasures and resources. They would cheat each other and kill each other. Zhou Rong was used to it. At this moment, Mr. Li's unguarded and generous behavior was like a clear stream, but Zhou Rong was not used to it. Chapter 419. Li Daocheng naturally didn't care what Zhou Rong thought. He broke off a piece and tossed it to her, then put the rest into his storage bag. Li Daocheng didn't know how to use this thing. He wasn't a tool refiner, so he didn't need to know. All he needed to know was that this thing was very valuable and useful. When Li Daocheng walked out of the cave, the infamily, and the cultivators didn't leave. Everyone seemed to want to see the Frost Soul origin crystal. Anmanian immediately went up to Li Daochong when he saw him. "Mr. Li, did you get the thing?" Li Daochong nodded. He scanned his surroundings and said, "Let's go to the infamily first." Anmanian was delighted. He immediately gave the order to return home. More than 10 luxurious flying shuttles flew over from the shadows. "Mr. Li, please." Anmanian opened the door for the first shuttle and greeted him. Li Daochong didn't stand on ceremony and got in. Yi Xiao, who was standing nearby, relaxed when he saw that Li Daochong seemed to have forgotten about him. Suddenly, Yi Xiao felt a strong suction force. He slid over to the flying shuttle Li Daochong was sitting in. The door wasn't closed. Li Daochong sat inside and looked at Yi Xiao. "How's the preparation of the 10 million spirit stones coming along?" Yi Xiao looked like he was about to cry. "Mr. Li, it's almost done. It'll be ready very soon." Li Daochong nodded expressionlessly. "All right, you still have an hour and a half. Come with me. When the Yi family sends the spirit stones, they'll let you go." As soon as Li Daochong finished speaking, Anmanian tacitly ordered someone to bring Yi Xiao to the flying shuttle behind them. The infamily's flying shuttles flew into the sky under the envious gazes of the cultivators. Old Gun and Bai Yi were also invited. Half an hour later, the infamily had a private residence on the outskirts of Crimson Sun City. This private residence was the real main residence of the infamily. The structure of the garden was augmented with spirit arrays, making it look like a fairyland. Li Daochong naturally had his reasons for coming to the infamily. He knew that the infamily wasn't having a good time recently, and it was mainly from Third Master Yin's words. Although the Third Master Yin was considered a big shot in the underworld of the Scarlet Sun planet, his influence was only limited to the ordinary people. In the eyes of the cultivators and the four families, Third Master Yin was just a lackey. Therefore, the Third Master Yin's knowledge of the situation was limited. This time, Li Daochong had come to the Red Sun, started a search for resources. He had some friendship with Insinuo and Ndingbang, but it wasn't that deep. Therefore, the infamily's difficulties had nothing to do with Li Daochong. However, this time, the infamily situation directly affected how much money Li Daochong could get. He couldn't help but care. Li Daochong had only come to the Scarlet Sun Star to take 200,000 mid-grade spirit stones from the Third Master Yin and then leave. Since the Third Master Yin couldn't afford it, Li Daochong couldn't return empty-handed. Moreover, he had heard that a treasure had appeared, so he naturally had to make a trip. After obtaining the Frost Soul Source Crystal, Li Daochong had struck it rich. In addition, he also had the Yi family's 10 million low-grade spirit stones and 200,000 mid-grade spirit stones. It didn't matter if he didn't get them. However, Anmanian was a loyal friend. In order to take a bullet for Yi Lingshun, he was even willing to face a Jindan cultivator head-on. Because of this, Li Daochong changed his mind. When they arrived at the infamily's private residence, Anmanian immediately welcomed Li Daochong into the family hall. Old Gun and Bai Yi were brought to another room to receive them. As for Yi Xiao, he was directly thrown into a side room and left alone. "Mr. Li, can you sell some of the Frost Soul Source Crystal to the infamily?" Anmanian asked carefully. Almost at the same time that Anmanian asked this question, Li Daochong's expression changed drastically. A sense of death enveloped him. Li Daochong's gaze turned cold. His divine senses, which had been greatly enhanced after the upgrade, instantly collided with the sense of death. With a loud boom, the family hall shook violently. After a few seconds, everything returned to normal. Li Daochong hurriedly withdrew the sense of death. Seeing that Li Daochong didn't reply, Anmanian was worried that Mr. Li wouldn't be willing to sell the Frost Soul Source Crystal when the family hall shook. Anmanian immediately realized something. When the shaking stopped, Anmanian was already sweating profusely. He asked fearfully, "Mr. Li, what's wrong?" Li Daochong was silent for a moment before he said, "Family head, and what exactly happened in the infamily recently?" Anmanian didn't answer. Instead, he looked around worriedly, as if he was being watched. He didn't dare to speak. Li Daochong could tell that Anmanian was worried. He continued, "Just tell me." I chased that thing away. Amani sighed. He told Li Daocheng everything that had happened, including some of his guesses. Li Daocheng's eyes narrowed slightly. That sense of death gave him a familiar feeling. The image of the young girl in the undying soul coffin from a few months ago surfaced in his mind. Could it be that there was a spatial rift connected to the Hades on planet Crimson Sun? Otherwise, it was impossible for such a strong sense of death to appear. Low-level dark ghosts definitely couldn't release something like this. It was even stronger than a soul-catcher ghost. If not for the fact that Li Daocheng was now at the mid-stage of the Jindan realm, he would definitely have been at a disadvantage against that sense of death. After Li Daocheng repelled that sense of death, it disappeared. Li Daocheng tried to track it down, but to no avail. He could only give up and turn to Manian. He extended his hand, and a frost soul origin crystal the size of a head appeared. Clan leader, and take this frost soul origin crystal. Contact the other party tomorrow and see if we can exchange it for Madam, and Li Daocheng said directly. Looking at the frost soul origin crystal, and Manian took it with trembling hands. Mr. Li, the Yin family will remember your great kindness. Li Daocheng waved his hand. You're welcome, clan leader. I'm still waiting for the Yi family to send the spirit stones over. I won't be chatting with you for a long time. With that, Li Daocheng left the clan hall and went to the room where Yi Xiao was locked up. Clan leader Yi, it's almost time. Where are my spirit stones? After Yi Xiao boarded the flying shuttle, there was no way he could go back on his word. He instructed the clan's upper echelons on the spirit net to quickly prepare the spirit stones. 10 million elementary-grade spirit stones was a huge sum of money. Even for a large clan from a fourth-class cultivation planet, it was still a huge sum. It was equivalent to 20 billion Federation dollars. Fortunately, the Yi family had been doing well over the years and had plenty of money. They quickly gathered 10 million spirit stones. Mr. Li, the spirit stones have been prepared. It's just that this place is heavily guarded and has a spirit formation, so the clan members can't find it, Yi Xiao said with a bitter expression. Li Daocheng nodded and turned to leave. He soon returned with Imani, and the two of them brought Yi Xiao out. Under Imonian's lead, they exited the spirit array in the mansion. A Yi family flying shuttle was flying around like a headless fly. It only descended when it saw Yi Xiao appear. 10 million elementary-grade spirit stones were stored in a storage ring. Li Daocheng took the ring and checked it. A hint of a smile flashed across his eyes. These spirit stones were enough for him to buy the materials needed to craft a level 12 talisman. Yi Xiao wanted to ask Li Daocheng if he could let him go now, but before he could say anything, Li Daocheng had already disappeared with Imanian. When they returned to the Yin family mansion, Li Daocheng was arranged to stay in the most luxurious suite in the mansion. This was originally reserved for the patriarch, Imanian. Now, it was being used to entertain Li Daocheng. After entering the room, Li Daocheng immediately entered a meditative state. He had just advanced to mid-stage Jindan, so he needed to stabilize his cultivation. The night passed quickly. The next day, Imanian used his old method to contact the kidnappers. At first, Imanian was worried that Li Daocheng had blocked their surveillance last night and that the kidnappers would fly into a rage out of humiliation. After contacting them, the kidnappers' tone didn't change much. They only asked if he had the item. After receiving an affirmative answer, the kidnappers told Imanian to go to the underground city and leave the item at the entrance of an ancient mansion. Although Imanian didn't trust the kidnappers, he didn't dare to disobey, so he could only do as he was told. As he stood at the entrance of the ancient mansion, Imanian felt uneasy for some reason. The hair on his back stood on end. However, there was nothing wrong with his surroundings. The temperature was normal, and the environment was normal. He was in a mossy little alley. However, the door to the mansion, which was at least several hundred years old, made Imanian extremely fearful. After tossing the Frost Soul Origin crystal aside, Imanian turned and fled. When he exited the alley, Imanian turned around and glanced behind him. The Frost Soul Origin crystal he had just left was gone. Imanian's hair stood on end. He was even more certain that the kidnappers were from the Hades. Not long after Manian left the alley, a young man dressed in a green martial arts robe appeared on the opposite side of the street. It was Li Daocheng. Li Daocheng's eyes shone with intense curiosity as he stared at the door to the old mansion at the end of the alley. In the depths of the old mansion, Li Daocheng sensed an extremely familiar aura. Master Chu. Chapter 420. The door to the old house was tightly shut. Li Daocheng's divine sense turned into countless threads and probed inside, carefully and slowly roaming. Just as Li Daocheng was probing, a bulge in his bosom suddenly moved, and a small monkey head poked out. Li Daocheng looked down. The sleeping Shabi had woken up for some reason, and it looked very excited. The little monkey had been sleeping peacefully in Li Daocheng's bosom, and had not made a sound since arriving on planet Crimson Sunday. Only when Li Daocheng attacked Oxhead did the Shabi react slightly, but it quickly calmed down. It seemed to know that Oxhead was not something it could deal with. This abnormal excitement could only mean one thing. The Shabi had sensed that it could capture and devour a ghost. The little monkey jumped out of Li Daocheng's bosom and climbed onto his shoulder, letting out a soft hiss. A pair of nimble monkey eyes stared at the door to the old house at the end of the alley. Li Daocheng reached out and patted the monkey's head. "Little guy, don't be impatient. If you like to eat that kind of thing, then just follow me. I won't let you starve." Li Daocheng's words seemed to have a magical effect on the little monkey. After he finished speaking, the little guy seemed to understand and calm down. Other than the saliva at the corner of its mouth, there was not much emotion on its face. Li Daocheng's divine sense threads weaved into a net and probed the old house. In fact, the old house was sealed by a strong death intent. However, this level of death intent could block Jean Dan's divine sense, but it could not block Li Daocheng's divine sense, which had reached Yuan Ying's level. He could not even sense it. There were at least 100 dark ghosts in the old house, and most of them were at the green ghost level. There were a few malicious ghosts and one soul catcher. There were also 3 abnormal death auras. Li Daocheng could not distinguish their levels. These 3 streams of death chi were neither strong nor weak. However, they were not pure death chi. In fact, they were not even death chi. Li Daocheng frowned slightly. He gathered all his divine sense and formed 3 divine sense threads. But just as Li Daocheng was about to concentrate on spying on these 3 strange death chi, his sea of consciousness suddenly shook. Li Daocheng immediately retracted the 3 threads of spiritual force. That was close. He had almost been discovered. Li Daocheng's face sank. To be able to discover his spiritual force thread, the other party's strength was unimaginable. Could it be Wu Gui? Li Daocheng's heart jumped. If it really was a Wu Gui, then it would be troublesome. However, this wasn't the real problem that Li Daocheng was troubled by. When he focused his detection earlier, Li Daocheng sensed that one of the death auras contained spiritual energy. As for that spiritual energy, he was very sure that it belonged to Chu Qianwei. Teacher Chu was on the Red Sun planet? Could it be that she had been assimilated by the Hades? Li Daocheng was very familiar with Chu Qianyue's aura. His perception couldn't be wrong. However, didn't Teacher Chu go to 13 Spectre? It was impossible for her to come out of that place without 2 or 3 years. Li Daocheng heard from Qian Shanghai that a trip to 13 Spectre was not easy. As long as you had the strength, you could exchange for a large amount of cultivation resources from the Federation. Many powerful individual cultivators in the Federation made their fortune there and eventually became powerful beings. How did Chu Qianyue appear on planet Crimson Sun after only a few months? Li Daocheng felt that something was wrong. He owed Chu Qianyue a favor. Perhaps without Chu Qianyue, Li Daocheng could also achieve something with a hot-blooded upgrader, but he definitely wouldn't have grown so much in such a short time. Chu Qianyue's devilish training for Li Daocheng during that period was extremely important. It strengthened his body, rapidly improved his combat skills, sharpened his spatial perception, and imperceptibly increased the speed at which he could condense his divine telekinesis. If it wasn't for that hellish training, Li Daocheng would have had to rely on himself to figure things out, and it would have taken a long time. Therefore, Li Daocheng being able to level up so quickly in just over a year and become a Jin Dan, Chu Qinyue's contribution couldn't go unnoticed. Perhaps she wasn't his teacher, but she was undoubtedly his guide. Li Daocheng also had some special feelings for Chu Qinyue. After all, at that time, everyone around him looked down on Li Daocheng. Only this frosty woman liked Li Daocheng very much. Although Chu Qinyue's way of treating people was unreasonable, and she even abused them as if she had a grudge against them, Li Daocheng could feel from some of the things that happened later that this extremely cold woman was quite protective of her own people. I can abuse you however I want, but as for the others, I'm sorry, you can't touch them. Whoever touches them, I'll beat them up, no matter what your background or identity is. Chu Qinyue also saved Li Daocheng's life. Without Chu Qinyue, Li Daocheng would have been killed when he encountered the assassin. And then there was no and then. The favor of recognizing his worth, the favor of saving his life. Two great favors. Only one of them could be repaid with his life. Not to mention that Chu Qinyue had done both. Li Daocheng had many shortcomings, such as being pretentious, ruthless, and even a little sinister. He didn't have many good points, but one of his few good points was that he knew how to repay kindness. Revenge for revenge, and repay kindness for kindness. Li Daocheng had very clear standard for these two things. Whether it was revenge or repaying kindness, there was a prerequisite. You had to be strong. You had to be strong enough to take revenge and repay kindness. Without strength, there was nothing to talk about. The current Li Daocheng clearly had the strength. Therefore, Li Daocheng didn't hesitate at all. Since Chu Qinyue's aura was in the old house full of dark ghosts, he had to go in and take a look, regardless of whether his detection was wrong or not. At that moment, Li Daocheng received a message on his wristwatch. It was from Emanian. The other party hadn't gone back on his word and had already released Madame and the Elders. With this, Li Daocheng didn't have any more worries. Li Daocheng retracted the spirit energy around him, just like a mortal. However, the Sun Jin Dan in his body was spinning violently, and the spirit energy inside was restless. Once it was released, it would erupt with unimaginable power. However, without Song Ink and the talisman, Li Daocheng felt that something was missing, but it was just something. Li Daocheng walked straight to the end of the alley. At almost the same time, in a room deep in the old house, Chu Qinyue was wearing a black robe and holding the Frost Soul Origin crystal that Emanian had left behind. Two other people were standing next to Chu Qinyue. One was one of the 4 commanders of Rakshasa State, Wu Gue Intercourse, and the other was Rakshasa Wu Ho's avatar, Luo Yingsha. If Li Daocheng saw this combination, he would definitely be shocked. This was because he had interacted with all 3 of them before. Needless to say, Chu Qinyue didn't need to be mentioned. Li Daocheng had never seen Wu Gue intercourse with his own eyes, but he had fought with him with his divine will and even killed one of his avatars. In the instant that he used his telekinesis to sense him, Li Daocheng had seen the intercourse's blurry appearance. As for Rakshasa Wu Ho and Cherry Blossom Gauze, Li Daocheng had only seen them once, but that one glance was enough to make him unable to forget them for the rest of his life. Chapter 421. Due to some special restrictions, Wu Ho's Cherry Blossom Gauze was only a doppelganger. Chu Qinyue and the Intercourse were both in person. Intercourse was a noble Wu ghost among the dark ghosts. Its strength was equivalent to a Yuanian cultivator. The biggest difference between Wu ghosts and dark ghosts was their physical bodies. Dark ghosts didn't have physical bodies. They only had ghost bodies, which were commonly known as ghosts. Wu ghosts were different. They were no longer wandering ghosts. Like all the creatures in the spiritual realm, they had flesh and blood. The creatures in the spiritual realm had 2 types of physical bodies, the mortal body and the spirit body. The creatures in the Hades also had 2 types of physical bodies, the Wu body and the devil body. The Wu body was weaker than the devil body. However, the Wu body was stronger than the spirit body. The weakest Wu ghost was equivalent to a cultivator in the early stage of Yuanian cultivator. Intercourse was originally a high-level Wu ghost. Its strength was comparable to a cultivator in the late stage, or even the peak stage of Yuaniing. However, 1,000 years ago, when the Hades invaded the spiritual realm, Intercourse was severely injured by a human divine transformation cultivator and was almost killed. It was lucky to escape, but only its soul was left. Intercourse had been slowly recovering for more than 1,000 years. Now, the Wu body was reformed, and its cultivation had recovered by more than half. However, compared to its peak, it was still much weaker. At present, it was only at the early stage of Yuaniing. However, as long as it had a strong enough soul, Intercourse could recover to its peak state at any time. It was just that it hadn't met a suitable target so far. Intercourse didn't dare to go to the 13th Spectre because the divine transformation cultivator who injured it left a trace of its divine soul in the demon-subduing city. The Wu ghosts and Grand Wizard ghosts that the divine transformation cultivator came in contact with would be detected as long as they appeared on 13th Spectre. The divine soul would automatically launch an attack. Intercourse couldn't even withstand a blow from the divine transformation cultivator at its peak, let alone now. Therefore, Intercourse couldn't go to the 13th Spectre at all. It could only find souls to devour through other channels. At this moment, Chu Qinyue's aura was very different from when it was at Xiansong University. In fact, it was very difficult to tell whether Chu Qinyue's breath was spiritual qi or death qi, or perhaps both. But this didn't make sense, because it was impossible for death energy and spiritual energy to coexist. These two completely opposite energy attributes would cancel each other out the moment they came into contact with each other. However, this did not happen to Chu Qinyue. If one could explore Chu Qinyue's body, they would find that the aura on her body was not the fusion of spiritual aura and death aura, but another kind of aura that existed outside of the two, corpse aura. In a very small number of ancient books, there was another name for corpse qi, dead spiritual qi. It was neither death aura nor spiritual aura. Corpse qi could only be possessed by a creature that was independent of the spirit realm and the netherworld. Zombies. Chu Qinyue's mother was a human being, and her father was the ancestor of Sorcerer. The probability of them having a child was only 1 in a billion. However, once the offspring were born, they could only be zombies. This was different from the zombies that Li Daocheng had encountered before and the zombies that were infected with zombie poison. Zombies were still dark ghosts, while zombies that were infected with zombie poison were just walking dead. To be precise, they were not zombies, but zombie puppets. In the ancient cultivation era, zombies were the descendants of ancient gods and had an endless lifespan. Because they did not belong to the spirit realm or the netherworld, they were not controlled by the law and could not die. Therefore, Chu Qinyue was neither a human nor a ghost, but a zombie. In fact, during the years that Chu Qinyue grew up in the spirit realm, even she herself did not know that she was not a human being, but a zombie. Moreover, when she was in the spirit realm, Chu Qinyue's body was not stimulated, so she completely maintained the characteristics of a human being. She could also use spiritual energy, but it was not easy to use it. Chu Qinyue herself did not know this. This was also why Chu Qinyue was actually in her 60s or 70s. But her cultivation was only at the foundation establishment stage, but her appearance had never changed. It was not until Chu Qinyue came to 13 Spectre and met her biological father, the ancestor of Rakshasa State, ancestor of Sorcerer Xing Paoyuo, that the zombie blood that had been dormant for decades was awakened by the latter. In the decades before that, Chu Qinyue cultivated desperately for only one purpose, and that was to avenge her mother. Chu Qinyue's mother was killed by her father, Xing Paoyuo, but when Chu Qinyue really saw her father, she knew that with her current strength, she could not even hurt a hair of her father. This was also why Chu Qinyue had to bury the monstrous hatred deep in her heart, and even show the joy of finding her biological father in front of Xing Paoyuo. Chu Qinyue would always remember how her father cruelly killed her mother, and how her mother risked her life to protect her and escape from the Hades. At that time, Chu Qianyue was still very young, only 9 years old, but the scene of her mother's death was deeply engraved in her mind. From birth to when her mother was killed, Chu Qianyue only saw her father twice after she began to remember. Both times were when she was 9 years old. The first time, her father came and left in a hurry. At that time, Chu Qianyue had just returned from outside, and the father and daughter brushed past each other. The second time was when her father came to kill her mother. Because she was still young and did not have any cultivation experience at that time, Chu Qianyue, who lived a carefree life, was not very clear about the strength of others. Therefore, she always thought that her father's strength should be comparable to the cultivators of Jindan, and always thought that her father was a ghost cultivator who sold his soul. Until a few months ago, Chu Qianyue found out that her biological father was actually a sorcerer ancestor of the Hades royal family, the king of Rakshasa state. He was equivalent to a divine transformation expert among cultivators. Not to mention the cultivators of Jindan. Even the cultivators of Yuanying were just a group of ants in her father's eyes. At that moment, Chu Qianyue felt that her desire to avenge her mother for decades was ridiculous. She thought that as long as she became a cultivator of Jindan, she would be able to avenge her mother. But it turned out that everything was just her own imagination. She came to 13 Spectre full of confidence when she was in the Foundation establishment stage, ready to start planning her revenge plan. She was simply pitifully stupid. However, Chu Qianyue did not expect that Xing Paoyuo not only did not have the slightest hostility towards her, but was also very happy, no different from other fathers who had lost their daughters, or even more excited. Xing Paoyuo brought Chu Qianyue to Rakshasa state, announced to the whole Rakshasa state, and held a granddaughter recognition ceremony, did a blood test, and then appointed her as Princess Qianyue of Rakshasa state. He also gave Chu Qianyue a lot of cultivation resources, land, and an army. In Rakshasa state, besides Xing Paoyuo and Wu Ho, in terms of status, Chu Qianyue was second. In Rakshasa state, Chu Qianyue was the powerful Princess Qianyue. Those sorcerer ghosts and grand wizard ghosts had to salute Chu Qianyue and call her Your Highness when they saw her. However, in the face of all this, Chu Qianyue only accepted it on the surface, but her desire for revenge was even stronger. In a short period of time, it was impossible for her to take revenge with her own strength. Even if she had a lot of resources to use now, and was also a zombie that defied the natural order, it was useless. Because her father's bloodline was also noble, and his strength was unfathomable, which was beyond Chu Qianyue's understanding. Therefore, Chu Qianyue had to take the long view, and in addition to continuing to cultivate desperately, she wanted to use the power of the human race to weaken the Rakshasa state. The Shenghua Federation, which bordered the Rakshasa state, was naturally the first choice. Everything that happened on Red Sun Planet was inextricably linked to Chu Qianyue, although she hoped that the Shenghua Federation and the Rakshasa state would have a large-scale war. However, Chu Qianyue could not do it too obviously. If the higher-ups of the Rakshasa state found out, even if she was the daughter of the sorcerer ancestor, she could not escape death, because the crime of treason was the most serious crime anywhere. She could not let Xing Paoyuo find out her real purpose. Originally, Chu Qianyue did not have any clue and did not know where to start until there was suddenly news about Wu Ho cherry blossom gauze, who had been missing for 1,000 years. In the operation to rescue the cherry blossom gauze, Chu Qianyue's plan was to let Wu Ho cherry blossom gauze wake up on Red Sun Planet, and then control the ghost cultivators on Red Sun Planet to accidentally destroy the space crack. In this way, it would be impossible for the cherry blossom gauze to return to the Hades quietly. The nether energy that would be released when she woke up would be enough to alarm the self-cultivators of the Federation and those old freaks. If someone like Wu Ho appeared in the depths of the Federation, the Divine Transformation Realm cultivators of the Shenghua Federation would immediately take action and eliminate her at all costs. Wu Ho had just woken up, and her strength was far from the peak. Even if she had slept for 1,000 years and recovered from the injuries she suffered, it was impossible for her to be at the peak as soon as she woke up. When the cherry blossom gauze was besieged while she was weak, she would only fly into a rage out of humiliation, and the destruction of Red Sun Planet would be inevitable. The Shenhua Federation would certainly take revenge on the Rakshasa state. Red Sun Planet was located in the fourth ring star zone, and it was impossible for the cherry blossom gauze to return to the Hades from there. She would definitely be besieged and killed by the Divine Transformation Realm cultivators. In this way, Chu Qianyue could kill two birds with one stone. She could kill the only person in the Rakshasa state, Wu Ho, and cause the Rakshasa state to suffer a great loss. Then, the Rakshasa state would start a full-scale war with the Shenhua Federation before it fully recovered. However, Chu Qianyue did not expect that the cherry blossom gauze could not fully wake up on Red Sun Planet for various reasons. And that was not the most terrible thing. The most terrible thing was that the ghost cultivator that Chu Qianyue controlled to destroy the space crack was killed. The guy who completely ruined Chu Qianyue's plan was actually her student, Li Daocheng. At that time, Chu Qianyue almost lost control of herself and went through the space crack to drag Li Daocheng to the Hades. Just when Chu Qianyue was gnashing her teeth in hatred, the cherry blossom gauze, who had successfully returned, flew into a rage after waking up. She was determined to tear Li Daocheng into pieces. It turned out that after the blood sacrifice was not completed and the cherry blossom gauze was awakened, her cultivation level dropped by a whole realm, and she was only at the level of a grand wizard. If she wanted to recover to the level of Wu Ho, she had to either cultivate in the Hades for 30 years or devour the soul of a Yuanying peak stage cultivator. No matter which one it was not easy. It would either take a lot of time or take a great risk. How could the cherry blossom gauze not be angry? How could she not hate him? If she completed the blood sacrifice and returned to the Rakshasa state, she would only need to do closed-door training for a year. After that, she could launch a full-scale invasion on the Shenhua Federation. At first, Chu Qianyue thought that the cherry blossom gauze was just angry and would soon go into closed-door training. Unexpectedly, not only did the cherry blossom gauze not go into closed-door training, but she immediately began to control Red Sun Planet. Her first goal was to destroy Li Daocheng. Chapter 422. In the Depths of the Ancient Residence. Empress Wu Ho, with this Frost Soul Origin Crystal, your Een Dragon Disc can be completely repaired, and you can summon a Een Dragon. Once your cultivation recovers, you can summon 3 Een Dragons at the same time. Even Soul Formation cultivators would tremble in fear. Intercourse's eyes were filled with deep reverence as he spoke with a fawning expression. In the Hades, status was clearly defined. The strong were respected, and power represented everything. If someone in a higher position was unhappy, they could crush someone in a lower position at any time. Intercourse was only a witch ghost. In front of Wu Ho, who was 2 levels higher than him, he acted like a lackey. Even though only Cherry Blossom Gauze's clone was present, Intercourse didn't dare to show any disrespect. In reality, the clone was very weak. It wasn't even as strong as Intercourse. It was about the late stage of Jin Dan, and it was only a ghost body formed by a strand of dead soul. It's not that easy to recover my cultivation. This Empress will definitely tear that damned human cultivator into pieces. If he hadn't ruined the blood sacrifice, this Empress wouldn't have lost her cultivation after waking up. Intercourse, don't just talk. Hurry up and think of a way to help this Empress capture 1 or 2 Yuanying cultivators for this Empress to enjoy. Cherry Blossom Gauze snorted coldly. Towards the end, she couldn't help but lick her lips with her moist red tongue. Intercourse's head shrank back slightly. He wanted to curry favor with her, but he ended up getting himself into trouble. Capture 1 or 2 Yuanying cultivators. Do you think Yuanying cultivators are bugs? You think you can capture them just because you want to? Damn it. If I were to capture Yuanying cultivators with my abilities, it would be hard to say who would be the one capturing who. Xiang Yu thought this in his heart, but he naturally didn't dare to show it on his face. He only said, "Don't worry, Empress. As long as this subordinate's cultivation advances a bit more, I will immediately go and capture 8 or 10 nascent soul cultivators for Empress." Cherry Blossom Gauz's expression was frosty. "God knows how long it will take for you to improve your cultivation. If you say such nonsense again in the future, I will definitely destroy your wizard body and make you a ghost to play with for a while." Intercourse was sweating profusely at the back of his head. He was so scared that he didn't dare to speak again. He stood to the side submissively. His pair of terrifying eyes were no longer fearful, but filled with fear. Cherry Blossom Gauze turned to Chu Qianyue and asked, "Qianyue, do you have any news about the human cultivator I asked you to investigate?" Chu Qianyue, who was somewhat entranced by the Frost Soul Source crystal, was obviously stunned for a moment. How could she not know about the person that Cherry Blossom Gauze wanted to investigate? Chu Qianyue basically knew some of the things that Li Daocheng had experienced during this period of time. She had heard it all from old Qian. After Chu Qianyue left the Blue Bay Star, she kept in touch with Qian Shanghai. Basically, she would send him a forbidden sound transmission once a month. Once this kind of sound transmission was intercepted, it would immediately dissipate. If there were no obstacles, it could be transmitted no matter how far the distance was. Chu Qianyue paused for a moment before replying to Your Highness, I'm not sure where that human cultivator is right now. However, Qianyue has collected some information about him. Oh, quickly let this Empress take a look. What is the origin of that damned human cultivator? Cherry Blossom Gauze couldn't wait. This time, the reason why Cherry Blossom Gauze created a doppelganger and came to the Red Sun Star was to find that human cultivator. If she happened to meet him, Cherry Blossom Gauze would beat him half to death and bring him back to the Hades. Chu Qianyue handed over the information talisman that she had prepared long ago to Cherry Blossom Gauze. The information about Li Daocheng on the talisman was all sorted out by Chu Qianyue after careful selection. Naturally, the part about her relationship with Li Daocheng was erased. In addition, there was no movement from him in the past month. As for the remaining information, even if Chu Qianyue didn't give it to Cherry Blossom Gauze, she could quickly obtain it through other means. Cherry Blossom Gauze's soul remembrance flashed and read through all the information in the talisman. Suddenly, Cherry Blossom Gauze's expression froze. "Who is it?" A shout startled the trembling Intercourse who was standing to the side. He was still worried that Wu Ho would destroy his shaman body. Chu Qianyue also revealed a puzzled expression. Intercourse and Chu Qianyue quickly reacted. The two of them immediately spread out their soul remembrance, but they didn't discover anything. Cherry Blossom Gauze felt that someone was watching her in that instant. However, that feeling disappeared as soon as it appeared. Even the powerful Cherry Blossom Gauze of the underworld soul couldn't capture any information. Intercourse, you said that a powerful psychic cultivator came to the clan. Last night, he even blocked your death consciousness's inspection. Can you perceive the strength of that person's psychic power? Cherry Blossom Gauze asked with a slight frown. Intercourse was still shocked and hurriedly replied, Queen Wu Ho, that person's psychic power is very strange. When this subordinate touched it, I felt like I got an electric shock. However, it doesn't seem to be very strong. Electric shock? Cherry Blossom Gauze also felt a slight electric shock just now. Someone is watching us, Cherry Blossom Gauze said coldly. Chu Qianyue's eyebrows moved slightly. Intercourse's pupils shrank, and he felt a little uneasy. He glanced outside the room unnaturally. Whoever was able to inspect in front of Wu Ho was naturally not weak. No matter what, it should be a Yuanying late-stage great cultivator. Intercourse immediately became nervous. He didn't want to meet a Yuanying late-stage great cultivator in the human territory. Queen Wu Ho, should we retreat? The space barrier of this old house won't last much longer. Once it loosens, we'll be exposed. Intercourse said cautiously. You're scared. Cherry Blossom Gauze looked at Intercourse with a pair of bewitching eyes that emitted a cold light. Queen Wu Ho is wise. I'm just thinking that this is the human territory, after all. Once we're exposed, I'm just a lowly general. It doesn't matter if I'm captured or killed. Queen Wu Ho's nether technique, heaven-reaching avatar, is unparalleled in the heavens and the earth. Naturally, you're not afraid. But Her Highness the Princess is different. Her Highness has just returned to the Hades, and her cultivation is still in the growth stage. Currently, she's not strong enough to fight against a human expert. If she's captured or something happens to her, it'll be a loss for the Rakshasa state. Intercourse didn't dare to look directly at Wu Ho. He was scared to death, but he still braced himself to say those words. There was even a hint of threat in his words. Intercourse had been scared witless ever since he arrived at the Red Sun planet. He was afraid of being discovered. Within the Shanghua Federation's fourth ring starfield, there were magical equipment devices that could detect death energy everywhere. These devices only had one function: detecting the death energy of soul catcher ghosts, and above was extremely sensitive. Once discovered, the Shanghua Federation's upper-level self-cultivators would be able to sense it immediately. Those below the soul catcher ghost level were much less dangerous. Plus, the death energy was weaker, so it was impossible to install such a high density of magical equipment. Thus, they only needed to detect the death energy of soul catcher ghosts and above. Almost every bustling self-cultivator planet would have dozens of such magical equipment floating in space. They were all aimed at the planet from 360 degrees without any blind spots. No matter how hard one tried to hide the death energy of soul catcher ghosts and above, there was no way to completely hide it. Once exposed, they would be discovered immediately. Intercourse and Cherry Blossom Gauze had stayed on the Red Sun planet for so many days without being discovered because they hadn't taken a single step out of the old mansion. This was because they couldn't leave at all. Intercourse had bought this underground mansion several decades ago. It had always been empty. In the past few decades, it had been guarded by few ghost cultivators. This old mansion had been set up with the coordinates of Hades. If necessary, the Hades could expend a huge amount of energy to break through space and open a spatial rift that led to the old mansion. This time, Cherry Blossom Gauze had made use of the coordinates here to set up a teleportation array and teleport over. But the price was that the Hades coordinates here would be damaged and could no longer be used in the future. Bang! Intercourse had just finished speaking when his entire body flew backward and crashed heavily into the wall. This was because the room was surrounded by a spatial barrier. Even though Intercourse had been sent flying with great force, he hadn't been able to break through the wall. "You dare threaten me?" Cherry Blossom Gauze's voice was so cold that it seemed to be able to freeze everything. Intercourse felt that 7 or 8 of his ribs had been broken. He coughed violently. Ignoring the pain, he hurriedly got up and knelt on the ground. He lowered his head and said, "Please see clearly, Your Majesty. This subordinate is speaking the truth. I have absolutely no intention of threatening Your Majesty. This subordinate would never dare to disrespect Your Majesty." "Humph." Cherry Blossom Gauze snorted coldly. Just as she was about to speak, a loud noise came from outside. Boom! At the same time, Li Daochong swaggered to the old mansion's door and kicked it open. This kick wasn't weak. Even though Li Daochong hadn't used his full strength, an ordinary door, even one made of silver, would have been sent flying with a kick. But this dilapidated wooden door, which looked like it could collapse at any time, was actually undamaged. It had only been kicked open. Li Daochong sensed a spatial barrier around them. The door was within the spatial barrier. Thus, most of the force of his kick had been absorbed by the spatial barrier. Li Daochong didn't care. He walked straight through the open door. As soon as he entered, the old door closed with a creak. Li Daochong didn't care at all about the door closing behind him. Instead, a light smile appeared on his face. He reached out and patted the little demon monkey sitting on his shoulder. "Little guy, is there anything you like to eat?" Chapter 423. Inside the mansion was a large courtyard overgrown with weeds. Inside was an open hall, but it was dark inside. It was impossible to see inside with the naked eye. Li Daocheng passed through the courtyard and entered the hall. As soon as he stepped in, several black shadows rushed toward him. Li Daocheng stood with his hands behind his back. He licked his lips, and his eyes flashed. He didn't move, but the little monkey sitting on his shoulder changed its usual naughty appearance. Its monkey face suddenly became ferocious, and it let out a low growl as it pounced. The Shabi was an ancient flying devil monkey that specialized in eating ghosts. The moment the little monkey pounced, its back wriggled violently. It extended a pair of fleshy wings, and its two monkey claws grew black nails. It grabbed the shadows and threw them into its mouth. In the blink of an eye, the shadows were eaten by the little monkey. Burp! A burp came from the little monkey's mouth. Flapping its fleshy wings, the little monkey flew into the darkness. Li Daocheng unhurriedly followed behind. This old house was much larger than he had imagined. It was actually several hundred meters deep, and the width was getting narrower and narrower. The entrance was more than 35 meters wide, and it became narrower and narrower. The deepest part of the house was less than 10 meters wide. It was a long trapezoid with 25 sections. This was the first time Li Daocheng had seen such a strange layout. It looked like a giant coffin. In the first 10 sections, there were more than 100 low-level dark ghosts. The small dark ghosts didn't even have a chance to resist before they were eaten by the Shabi. As Li Daocheng walked forward, he could clearly hear the sound of the Shabi chewing on the dead souls. Li Daocheng stroked his chin as he walked. His eyes flashed with lightning as he looked at a certain part of the darkness with interest. There, the Shabi was eating with relish. This was the first time Li Daocheng had seen a dark ghost eat like this. It was like eating real food. The untouchable dead souls seemed to have a physical body in front of the Shabi, and they were eaten with great relish. Wow, that works too, Li Daocheng muttered to himself. After the 10th round, Dark Ghost's level began to rise. At the level of the Green Ghost, the Shabas were much more difficult to deal with. They could deal with one, but if two Shabas came, they would not be able to deal with them. However, this little thing was quite clever. When it saw that it couldn't win, it immediately returned to Li Daocheng's side. The two green ghosts didn't know what was good for them and continued to charge forward. Li Daocheng only used the pressure of his spiritual aura to shake the two green ghosts to the point that their souls almost scattered. The little Shabi monkey once again flew up and swallowed the two dying green ghosts into its stomach, revealing a satisfied expression. After eating so much, the Shabi monkey's stomach was round and its body had grown bigger. It was like a balloon that had been inflated. After eating more than 10 green ghosts, the Shabi monkey seemed to feel a little bloated, but its round little eyes were still shooting out a greedy gaze, as if it wanted to eat all the nether ghosts here. The man and the monkey traveled unimpeded. Of course, this was all because Li Daocheng's strength had increased by leaps and bounds. The malicious ghosts were just playthings in front of Li Daocheng. If they wanted to play with you, they could exchange a few blows. If they didn't, they could be destroyed with a wave of his hand. When Li Daocheng killed the third malicious ghost, the Shabi monkey let out an excited cry. It actually cupped its hands toward Li Daocheng, as if saying, "Master, you're too powerful. I admire you, I admire you." The Shabi monkey did not eat the 3 malicious ghosts. Li Daocheng knew that this little thing's level was not high enough to eat them. Even if it ate them, it would not be able to digest them. Those green ghosts were enough for it to digest for a while. It was a pity that Li Daocheng did not have any magic treasures that could store dead souls. Otherwise, he would have wiped out the souls of the 3 malicious ghosts, sealed them, and given them to the Shabi monkey to eat later. After entering the 20th step, the 3 strange auras that Li Daocheng had sensed before did not appear. It was as if they did not exist. Li Daocheng suspected that he had detected wrongly. Or perhaps the 3 auras were just released by some kind of creature with Hades. After sensing his aura, they ran away. But when Li Daocheng stepped into the 21st step, his body suddenly shook. A terrifying aura of death enveloped him. This was the strongest aura of death that Li Daocheng had ever sensed in his life. There was no other. It was even stronger than the aura of death that the coffin girl had released. It was just that this aura of death was almost exactly the same as the aura of the coffin girl, only stronger. Li Daochong felt a chill on his back and immediately became alert. Could it be the coffin girl? Just as this thought flashed through Li Daochong's mind, a faint sigh came from the darkness. In this kind of lightless darkness, hearing such a sigh, no matter how brave one was, they would have goosebumps. Immediately after, the other two auras also emerged. Li Daochong's pupils suddenly shrank. Although one of the auras was a little strange, it was too similar to Chu Qianyue's aura. But why did Teacher Chu's aura have the aura of death? Although there was no light around, Li Daochong had the eye of thunder punishment. Therefore, in his eyes, it was not darkness, but a blue light. The stronger the aura of death, the stronger the blue light. However, Li Daochong was not very used to this kind of visual perception. Just when Li Daochong felt that he was about to see the owner of the three auras, the auras disappeared again. Li Daochong's face tightened, and he quickened his pace to catch up. After just a few steps, he heard the crying of a girl. Whoa! It wasn't the kind of wailing that would make one's hair stand on end. Even in the gloomy and scary environment around, the crying was not scary at all. The crying was not loud, but it was heavier than sobbing. It was very similar to the crying of a girl squatting on the street who had been wronged. Li Daochong stopped and looked toward the direction of the sound. The sound came from a side room in front of him, and there was a flickering candlelight inside. There was someone in this damn place? Li Daochong would not believe it, even if he was beaten to death. Pretending to be a ghost, I like to see what the hell you are. Li Daochong's mind flashed, and he immediately walked to the side room. He glanced at the ancient wooden paper window and could see the figure of a delicate girl inside. Li Daochong smiled coldly and stretched out his hand to the door of the side room. He only released a trace of spiritual qi in his hand, and the door was shaken open with a bang. The decoration in the side room was no different from the ancient mortal residence. There was an ancient bed, a square table in the middle, and a dressing table, which was the most common in ghost movies. A girl wearing a pink dress was sitting on the ground beside the bed, hugging her legs. Her delicate body was slightly trembling, and she was still crying. When the door was shaken open, the girl immediately raised her head in panic and looked at Li Daochong walking in. Her body trembled even more, and her big eyes were filled with fear. She curled up under the bed, wishing she could get under the bed. Unfortunately, the space was too small for the girl to get under. Is it finally my turn? The girl suddenly opened her mouth. Li Daochong was stunned by this question. He locked his spiritual force on the girl, but he did not feel the slightest trace of death qi. Instead, there was a weak vitality coming from the girl. Li Daochong was suddenly confused. Was there really someone in this damn place? What's your turn? Li Daochong asked casually. It's my turn to seduce people here. The girl looked at Li Daochong with a pair of big watery eyes, and her face showed confusion. Li Daochong did not answer, and just looked at the girl. After a few seconds, Li Daochong suddenly stepped forward and slapped the girl's forehead. The latter was motionless and did not respond at all. Li Daochong's palm was fast and fierce, and it suddenly stopped an inch away from the girl's head. You don't need me anymore? You want to kill me? The girl said sadly. Li Daochong still did not answer, and just looked at the girl. Ghost Lord, do it. I only ask that you don't turn me into a ghost. Let me die completely. The girl's expression became stupefied. Li Daochong's spiritual force directly attacked the girl's spiritual sea. She did not lie. Is she really human? Did I make a mistake? Li Daochong was puzzled. Just as Li Daochong was hesitating, the girl's eyes suddenly flashed red, and she grabbed Li Daochong's wrist. The vitality in her body disappeared in an instant, and a huge amount of death qi came out. It was the same death qi that Li Daochong had sensed before. It was the same death qi as the girl in the coffin, but more terrifying. Damn it. Chapter 424. The girl's face blurred for a moment. When it became clear, Li Daochong's heart skipped a beat. He would never forget that pair of demonic red eyes for the rest of his life. However, Li Daocheng wasn't frightened. He just didn't understand why he couldn't detect the aura of death on the girl's body. Not only did he not detect the aura of death, but he also detected life, force, and spiritual energy. Could creatures of the underworld also produce life, force, and spiritual energy? Li Daocheng was very puzzled, but now was not the time to consider this question. The moment the girl grabbed his wrist, when the girl grabbed Li Daocheng's hand, the Sun Jin Dan in his body instinctively erupted with powerful spiritual energy. The girl was Wu Ho's clone of Cherry Blossom Gauze. The clone was formed from a strand of death intent, so Cherry Blossom Gauze could change her appearance at will. Cherry Blossom Gauze didn't know that the person who had come was Li Daocheng. She only thought that he was some powerful cultivator who had discovered the old residence. When she saw Li Daocheng, she almost couldn't help but rush up and tear this human cultivator to shreds. In the end, Luo Yingsha resisted the urge to rush up and kill him. This was because she couldn't see through this cultivator who was only a foundation establishment stage cultivator a few months ago. Cherry Blossom Gauze was very confused. If she couldn't see through him, it meant that this person's cultivation was at least at the Jin Dance stage. How could a cultivator's strength increase so much in such a short period of time? Could it be that he had hidden his strength back in the stone cave? Cherry Blossom Gauze couldn't think of any other possibility. Cherry Blossom Gauze knew that human cultivators cultivated at an extremely fast speed. They could reach the Jin Dan stage in a few years and become Yuanying in a dozen years. This was also why the Hades had been stopped by human cultivators when they had devoured more than half of the spirit realm. If not for the human cultivators, the entire spirit realm would have been devoured by the Hades long ago. If that was the case, the Hades would be unprecedentedly powerful and could even continue to advance further. That was the real target of the Hades. But Hades had never imagined that human cultivators would be so difficult to deal with, so much so that he had almost suffered a great loss. However, he had still lost quite a bit of his vitality, so much so that he still hadn't fully recovered. Human self-cultivators were not powerful, but their growth rate was the fastest, second to none. The Hades had destroyed so many races, numbering in the tens of thousands. Among them were the insufferably arrogant giant race, desolate race, and sacred race. In ancient times, these races were called the god race by human cultivators. But these so-called divine races were completely unable to withstand a single blow in front of the underworld. Even if they had a powerful cultivator who was even more powerful than a divine transformation realm cultivator, it wouldn't be of any help. Hades, on the other hand, stopped in front of a human cultivator who was considered relatively weak in a vast spirit realm. Not only did this battle last for over 100 years, but also damaged his vitality. Because of this, several demon masters had their vitality damaged and had no choice but to fall into a deep sleep. They had yet to wake up. The Rakshasa state was only an above-average Hades nation in Hades. The highest level was only the witch ancestor Xing Paoluo, and there was no devil royal family. The witch ancestor strength was equivalent to the peak of the divine transformation realm. But in front of the devil royal family, it was nothing. Cherry Blossom Gauze's level was basically the same as Xing Paoluo's. Of course, that was when she was at her peak, but she was definitely far from it now. When Cherry Blossom Gauze sneak attacked this human cultivator and grabbed his wrist, she actually couldn't control him. The death aura that invaded her hand was all blocked and couldn't enter the human cultivator's body at all. That wasn't all. Cherry Blossom Gauze felt a burning sensation on her palm, and a wisp of green smoke rose. If it wasn't for the fact that Cherry Blossom Gauze's divine will clone had an extremely condensed death aura, she would probably have been sent flying. Cherry Blossom Gauze wanted to let go of her hand, but it wasn't up to her. Li Daocheng looked at the green smoke rising from the small pale hand that grabbed his wrist. He sniffed his nose and revealed an expression of enjoyment, saying, "What a nice smell." When Cherry Blossom Gauze heard this, her body trembled for some reason, and she actually felt a trace of fear. This feeling was somewhat similar to the feeling she had when she saw the devil royal family in Hades. He has the bloodline of the devil race. When this groundless thought appeared in Cherry Blossom Gauze's mind, even she herself was shocked. That's impossible. Cherry Blossom Gauze thought in her heart and blurted out. Li Daocheng didn't understand what she meant. He only thought that this girl of unknown origins in Hades was surprised by his strength. Anything is possible. Li Daocheng replied playfully and punched directly at the girl's face. He didn't have the slightest bit of pity for her pale but beautiful face. Cherry Blossom Gauze was shocked. She couldn't break free of the human cultivator's hand, so she simply gave up. Her wrist was broken, and she flew backwards. Li Daocheng's fist missed, and only a slender hand was left on his wrist. However, that hand quickly turned into a cloud of black smoke and disappeared. Li Daocheng was just about to give chase when he felt a chill behind him. A black light shot towards him. Li Daocheng felt that something was wrong, so he didn't fight it head-on. He dodged to the side and dodged the black light. The black light shot into the ground and disappeared. A slender man appeared in the room, looking at Li Daocheng with a bloodthirsty look in his eyes. Intercourse exclaimed softly. He didn't expect this human cultivator to be able to dodge his sneak attack. What surprised Intercourse even more was that Cherry Blossom Gauze's clone not only didn't hurt that human cultivator at all, but also cut off one of his hands. Li Daocheng had just stood still when a cold light whizzed towards him. At that moment, Li Daocheng's pupils suddenly shrank. He saw Chu Qianyue. Li Daocheng was stunned for a moment and narrowly dodged the cold light. The clothes on his chest were cut open, but his skin was not hurt. Li Daocheng was really shocked this time. Why would Chu Qianyue attack him? And why was she in cahoots with the Netherworld race? Li Daocheng looked at Chu Qianyue in surprise. Just as he was about to speak, a telepathic message sounded in his sea of consciousness. Don't say anything. Pretend you don't know me. I'll tell you later. It was a simple sentence, but the information was huge, and it brought about endless imagination. Li Daocheng swallowed back his words, but his heart was a little relieved. Chu Qianyue said so. At least it meant that she wasn't in cahoots with the Netherworld race. There must be something hidden. All of a sudden, Cherry Blossom Gauze, Intercourse, and Chu Qianyue surrounded Li Daocheng in the room. Kill the female ghost first, then kill the man. Chu Qianyue's telepathic message sounded again. Li Daocheng remained calm, but a glimmer of light flashed in his eyes. After all, the master and disciple had been together for a period of time, and they had fought together for such a long time, so they had a tacit understanding. Intercourse, what are you waiting for? Hurry up and tell me. Catch him. I want him alive. Cherry Blossom Gauze's doppelganger, who had lost one hand, ordered through gritted teeth. Although he hated Li Daocheng very much, Cherry Blossom Gauze still had a lingering fear. The doppelganger's strength was limited, so he didn't dare to get close. Intercourse naturally didn't dare to neglect Wu Ho's order. He put his hands together and murmured. A black snake appeared out of thin air and opened its mouth to bite Li Daocheng. Boom! Li Daocheng punched out. Spiritual energy shot out in all directions, and the black snake was directly scattered in the air. Intercourse's face changed greatly. This human cultivator was actually so rude and unreasonable. Chu Qianyue also showed a surprised look. In her impression, Li Daocheng was never so powerful. Intercourse's strength was equivalent to Yuan Ying's initial stage. Even if he didn't use any killing moves, the power of his attack was definitely not something a Jindan cultivator could withstand. Li Daocheng actually defeated Intercourse's attack with only one fist. Li Daocheng was too curious about Chu Qianyue's situation. He just wanted to get rid of the two eyesores in front of him as soon as possible. He didn't want to waste any time. Therefore, Li Daocheng used his true strength as soon as he came up. He punched out and disappeared. The next moment, he appeared behind Intercourse. He punched out again. Intercourse narrowly dodged, and his hair almost stood up in fear. Li Daocheng's attack missed, and he followed it up with another punch. Psychic attacks came one after another, and Xiang Yu was exhausted from dodging. At this time, Chu Qinyue also attacked Li Daochong. However, her attacks seemed to be fierce. In fact, only Li Daochong knew that the move she used was the same one they used when they practiced together. Li Daochong had long been familiar with this kind of attack. He knew how to deal with it without looking. However, after Chu Qinyue joined in, it immediately became 2 against 1, and Li Daochong was a lot more tired. Cherry Blossom Gauze moved at this time and also launched an attack. 3 against 1. Just as Cherry Blossom Gauze was performing dark witchcraft, blue-golden lightning flashed fiercely in Li Daochong's eyes. Boom! 2 thunderbolts bombarded out. Chapter 425. There was no need for intercourse to warn her. Cherry Blossom Gauze knew something was wrong when the 2 bolts of lightning flashed. However, there was no way she could dodge the lightning. Cherry Blossom Gauze felt an unprecedented threat of death at that moment. She had never felt this way, even when she was facing a soul formation stage cultivator. Boom! The eye of thunder punishment pierced through Cherry Blossom Gauze's clone. Lightning flashed. Cherry Blossom Gauze stared at Li Daochong in disbelief. On a dark dead star somewhere in the Hades, Cherry Blossom Gauze's true body let out a muffled groan. Her soul consciousness was shaken, and a pained expression appeared on her pale face. In a room deep in the ancient mansion, Cherry Blossom Gauze's clone was pierced through by lightning. Lightning flashed across her delicate body. A loud smack was heard. Cherry Blossom Gauze's clone disappeared. Li Daochong had reached the mid-stage of the Jindan realm. The power of the Eye of Thunder Punishment had reached another level. This time, he was able to destroy Cherry Blossom Gauze's clone, which was close to the late stage of the Jindan realm. Intercourse was dumbfounded. That was Wu Ho's clone. How could it be destroyed by this human cultivator? The blue-golden lightning in Li Daochong's eyes didn't disappear. Instead, they shone even brighter. He didn't have the patience to continue fighting. He turned around and looked at Intercourse. This Rakshasa state law protector was shocked for no reason. He turned around and ran without thinking. The Yang Lightning's damage to the Nether Soul was too terrifying. Even with Yuanying's early-stage strength, Intercourse didn't dare to take it head-on. How could Li Daochong let Intercourse leave? Lightning flashed in his eyes. The Eye of Thunder Punishment. The second attack. Boom! 2 more bolts of lightning shot out. This one was even thicker than the previous one. Intercourse let out a roar, and his figure instantly transformed into a giant black python. He didn't hesitate to burn his soul force and use the death ray escape technique. The speed of this escape technique was almost as fast as the speed of light, but it was extremely harmful to the body. Intercourse, one would lose a layer of skin even if they transformed into another beast. Intercourse didn't care about anything else in order to save his life. He directly rushed into the spatial gap at the back of the mansion. That was the passageway used to return to the Hades, but that passageway could only be opened once, and then it would disappear. Intercourse. The moment he drilled into the hole, he was struck by Ling Yang lightning. The body of the black python that was stained with lightning disappeared into the hole. Then, the hole quickly closed. Intercourse's aura completely disappeared. Intercourse, after drilling out of the hole, he was blasted more than 10 kilometers away, like a meteor smashing into a mountain in the land of death. Any of the wandering nether ghosts that came into contact with the lightning would immediately be obliterated into nothingness. A giant black python was curled up in the pit. Its body was smoking, and its skin was almost completely charred. The black python gradually shrank and turned into a human figure. Intercourse's face was black, and his hair was all burnt. He looked extremely embarrassed. Huff, huff. Intercourse gasped for breath. Although he felt extremely uncomfortable, he finally saved his life. However, he couldn't get up for a while. He could only lie in the pit and slowly recover. In the side room of the mansion, the lightning in Li Daochong's eyes flickered, and it slowly disappeared after several minutes. Li Daochong only felt a wave of exhaustion. At the same time, he released the Eye of Thunder Punishment at full power, which consumed a lot of energy. Li Daochong immediately sat down cross-legged and began to adjust his aura. He didn't guard against Chu Qianyue, who was standing on the side. "Student Li, aren't you afraid that I'll kill you while you're weak?" Chu Qianyue said, trying to hide the shock in her heart. In just a few months, Li Daochong's strength had reached such a level. He had far surpassed her, his former teacher. Even Chu Qianyue, who had always been cold, couldn't hide her surprise. "If I wanted to do it, I would have done it a long time ago. Why wait until now? Teacher Chu, I haven't seen you for a few months, but you also know how to joke?" Li Daochong raised his eyebrows and said. Chu Qianyue's eyes flickered, and she smiled for the first time. Li Daochong was slightly stunned. This was the first time he saw Chu Qianyue smile. Her beautiful face, which was always frozen, was charming and had a different flavor when she smiled. "What are you laughing at?" Li Daochong quickly calmed down and asked. "Nothing. I just suddenly wanted to laugh. You didn't let me down. Instead, you gave me a big surprise." Chu Qianyue was not stingy with her praise. "It's my duty as a student to live up to Teacher Chu's expectations," Li Daochong said with a smile. "The student has surpassed the master. Your cultivation is now higher than mine, but you still call me Teacher Chu. I can't accept it." Chu Qianyue told the truth. Whether it was cultivators or Hades, strength was respected. Only the strong could be called teacher. A teacher for a day, a teacher for life. Teacher Chu is Daochong's guide. In Daochong's heart, you will always be my teacher. Li Daochong said sincerely. "If I were a human, it wouldn't matter if you think so. Unfortunately, I'm not a human. Aren't you afraid that having me as your teacher will be detrimental to your future development?" Chu Qianyue asked directly. "Not a human." Li Daochong had already guessed some clues, but when Chu Qianyue said it herself, he still couldn't accept it. "Yes." Chu Qianyue nodded. "It doesn't matter if I'm not a human. You taught me, so you're my teacher." Li Daochong shrugged and said indifferently. There was a moment of silence. Chu Qianyue seemed to be waiting for Li Daochong to ask her questions, but the latter didn't have this intention at all. Instead, he closed his eyes and carefully adjusted his breath. "Don't you have any questions to ask me?" Chu Qianyue broke the silence. "There's nothing to ask. No matter who you are, where you come from, or what you are, it doesn't matter. You saved my life and taught me a lot. That's enough." Li Daochong's breath gradually stabilized. He slowly opened his eyes and looked at Chu Qianyue. "Then if I ask you to help me, will you help me?" Chu Qianyue asked curiously. "It's my duty." Li Daochong didn't even think about it. When Chu Qianyue heard such an answer, a warm current flowed through her heart. There was a trace of fluctuation in her eyes when she looked at Li Daochong. "I'm the princess of the Rakshasa state. My father is the king of the Hades state, wizard ancestor Xing Pa Yuo. All the dark ghosts and ghost beasts that the Shanghua Federation is fighting on the front line are all from the Rakshasa state. The Rakshasa state is just one of the many Hades empires. Its strength is above average, similar to the status of the Shanghua Federation in the spiritual world. The Rakshasa state's national policy is to swallow the entire Shanghua Federation, integrate this spiritual world into the Rakshasa state, and let all the creatures in the Federation become the food of the Rakshasa state," Chu Qianyue said simply. After that, Chu Qianyue looked directly at Li Daochong, wanting to see how he would react. However, there was no reaction. After a while, Li Daochong stood up from his cross-legged state and said slowly, "And then?" Chu Qianyue looked at Li Daochong in astonishment. It was one thing for this kid to not have any reaction after hearing such important news, but to ask what then? "Brat, is there something wrong with your brain, or are you still the same as before? You've become stronger, but your brain is still a fool? Aren't you afraid that I'll ask you to help me deal with the human race?" Chu Qianyue almost shouted. "If that's the case, I'll kill you with my own hands." "But I know that you won't," Li Daochong replied with certainty. "Why not?" Chu Qianyue showed a trace of doubt. "Because you're not a dark ghost. Is that so? Then I'll let you feel the death aura on my body." Chu Qianyue's aura began to rise as she spoke. The temperature in the room kept dropping, and the death aura became more and more intense. It had reached the level of a soul catcher. Chu Qinyue's small face, which was as cold as ice, now seemed to be able to freeze the desert into a glacier. Teacher Chu, no matter how you try to hide your life force and spiritual aura, it's futile in front of me. It's impossible for creatures of the Hades to have spiritual aura. Even if they do, it's just an illusion. But the spiritual aura on your body is not an illusion, it's real. So you're not a dark ghost, at least not completely. Moreover, the death aura on your body is very strange. It's different from all the dark ghosts I've met. As for what it is, I can't tell. Li Daochong stroked his chin. Do you know about zombies? Chu Qinyue asked immediately. I see. Li Daochong immediately understood. He continued, You're a zombie? More or less. My mother is a human, and my father is the witch ancestor. They're completely different races. The probability of them producing offspring is even lower than finding a needle in the sea. Chu Qinyue nodded. Li Daochong looked pensive. This was completely different from the origin of zombies in his previous world. The reason why zombies were produced here was actually the product of the combination of creatures of the dead and creatures of the spiritual world. Zombies were soulless. Could it be that after the two souls fused, they disappeared, and the offspring born were soulless, thus becoming zombies? Li Daochong used his unlimited imagination. Suddenly, Li Daochong's telekinesis power sensed a trace of the power of dead souls. His eyes narrowed, and he shot out like lightning. In a dilapidated room opposite the room, a half-dark body soul catcher was crawling on the ground, listening to something. Li Daochong was too fast. Before the soul catcher could react, a large hand had already tightly strangled its neck. Chapter 426. The musical soul ghost was a very special type of soul catcher ghost. Its combat power was not strong, and could even be said to be weak. It was even weaker than some ferocious ghosts. However, the musical soul ghost had already condensed a half-nether body, so it was classified as a soul catcher ghost. It had an extremely powerful soul. It was somewhat similar to the psyche cultivators among cultivators. Its dead soul telekinesis was extremely condensed, but it was different from the psyche cultivators. The musical soul ghost's dead soul telekinesis was not strong, but it could transmit sound waves through space. In the Hades, the musical soul ghost was a necessary servant of the Nether clan above the witch ghost. Chu Qinyue was anxious. If the conversation between her and Li Daochong was transmitted to the Rakshasa state, then her plan to provoke the Rakshasa state to attack the Shenghua Federation ahead of time would be completely ruined, and she would not be able to return to the Rakshasa state. On the surface, Xing Paoyuo seemed to value and dote on his daughter, but Chu Qinyue knew very well that there were prerequisites and conditions. When she was just born, Xing Paoyuo did not care about her at all. From her birth to her mother's death, Chu Qinyue only saw Xing Paoyuo twice in 7 years. After decades, Xing Paoyuo's attitude towards her seemed to have changed a lot. Chu Qinyue was still investigating the reason. At present, she only knew that Xing Paoyuo's life was not easy. A group of grand wizard ghosts in the Rakshasa state had been doubting him for nearly 100 years. They thought that Xing Paoyuo had missed many opportunities to hurt the Shenghua Federation. What Xing Paoyuo needed most now was allies and the support of others. Looking at the whole Rakshasa state, his supporters were few and far between. According to Chu Qinyue's understanding of Xing Paoyuo, he was very likely to create some supporters in a situation where he did not have any. Appointing her as Princess Qinyue was one of the ways to create supporters. There was nothing better than finding his long-lost daughter. Those opponents could not even find an excuse to object. In addition, Xing Paoyuo had been using a lot of new people recently. Intercourse was one of them. Xiangyu was just a witch ghost, and a witch ghost that had just evolved. There were at least a dozen great witch ghosts in Luocha country that were stronger than him, and there were also some veteran witch ghosts that were even more in number. However, in the intercourse, he was appointed as one of the 4 great protectors. He had neither strength nor ability. Chu Qianyue was very clear that in Xing Paoyuo's eyes, he was just a chess piece that could be used in the future, so he gave himself a lot of benefits to keep him. The high status of the princess, the vast land of the Rakshasa state, the supreme power, and even the powerful strength. After the zombie blood in Chu Qianyue's body had been activated, her strength had advanced by leaps and bounds. After this short period of cultivation, she had made another step forward. Now that she has reached the middle stage of Jindan, Chu Qianyue has a secret that no one knows. That is, she can still use the cultivation techniques, magic weapons, and talismans of cultivators. In fact, he was even more proficient in using it, and its power was even greater. Therefore, Chu Qianyue's strength was far more than what it looked like. Intercourse had always looked down on this princess who relied on her father's relationship to get to the top. However, if one day Intercourse could not help but rebel against Chu Qianyue, then he would realize how ridiculous his idea of looking down on Chu Qianyue was. Li Daochong naturally recognized the musical soul ghost. When he discovered it, he had already covered it with his spiritual sense. At this moment, his spiritual sense turned into countless threads and invaded the musical soul ghost's dead soul. It's okay, it didn't hear much. The part that was transmitted out was also interfered with by my spiritual sense, so it has already disappeared. Teacher Chu, you don't have to worry. Li Daochong said after searching the musical soul ghost's dead soul. Hearing this, Chu Qianyue's heart relaxed, and then she said, destroy it. The musical soul ghost is very cunning. It can also use illusory sounds to confuse people. Even without Chu Qianyue's order, Li Daochong would do so. How could he miss such a delicious food? With a pinch of his hand, the musical soul ghost was pinched into meat paste by Li Daochong's big hand before it even had the chance to scream. Spiritual qi poured in from the wound of the musical soul ghost like a tide, and then the dark body and the ghost body began to burn, turning into a ball of raging blue fire. The musical soul ghost struggled desperately in the flame, uttering terrifying cries. Surrounded by Li Daochong's gang spirit barrier, no sound could be transmitted out. After a while, the musical soul ghost was completely burned out and disappeared into nothingness. A faint dark green mist was sucked into Li Daochong's body. Beep! One musical soul ghost was killed. Soul power gained. A prompt came from the depths of Li Daochong's sea of consciousness. The spiritual qi in his body increased a little, but there was still a long way to go before he could level up. Every time Li Daochong leveled up, the amount of spiritual qi required for the next level was almost as much as the total amount of spiritual qi required for the previous levels. The increase was extremely terrifying. Thus, when he reached the middle stage of Jindan, the amount of spiritual qi converted from killing a low-level soul catcher ghost was not much to Li Daochong. After killing the musical soul ghost, Li Daochong swept through the mansion from top to bottom, eliminating all the fish that had escaped the net. Only then did he return to his original room. The master and disciple chatted for a long time. About an hour later, Li Daochong came out of the mansion. The spatial barrier around the mansion had disappeared. It was already afternoon when Li Daochong returned to the family. Princess Catherine and old ghost Zhang were also brought here. After Imanian returned, he sent someone to investigate the mansion. In the end, the scout returned and said that there was nothing inside. He only saw Li Daochong walking out of the mansion. In reality, Li Daochong deliberately let the scout see him. Imanian told the scout to check the mansion after Li Daochong left. The scout did as he was told. When he entered, he saw that it was a mess. It was obvious that a great battle had taken place. The death aura in the mansion was still very strong, but not a single dark ghost could be found. The scout used the most advanced spiritual light instrument to scan the place. The result almost scared the scout to death. There were fragments of the dark ghost's dark body everywhere. Most of them only had their edges and corners left. Someone had torn all the dark ghosts here to shreds. The spy reported everything he had found to Imanian without missing a single detail. The higher-ups of the family were horrified. Li Daocheng's performance outside the grotto was already shocking enough, but they still underestimated him. And Sinuo originally wanted to look for Li Daocheng to reminisce about old times. But when she heard that Li Daocheng had torn those things from the Hades to shreds, an indescribable feeling arose in her heart. She knew that she could no longer speak freely with Li Daocheng like in the past. It was even more impossible for them to become friends. The two of them were from different worlds. And Dingbang had always treated Li Daocheng as a brother, but now he couldn't. And Dingbang sighed softly. His talent was limited. In the end, he couldn't keep up with Li Daocheng's footsteps. Amanian prepared a banquet of the highest standards to receive Li Daocheng, but he was rejected. Li Daocheng didn't come to Planet Crimson Sun to show off. He had basically achieved his goal, but he still had to give Third Master Yin the money he deserved. The next day, Li Daocheng went to the Crimson Gold Mansion again. This time, Third Master Yin was bent over, almost kneeling on the ground. In less than half an hour, Third Master Yin handed over 200,000 mid-grade spirit stones to Li Daocheng. After returning to the Yin clan, Amanian gave Li Daocheng an extra 100,000 mid-grade spirit stones. This was considered to be the purchase of the Frost Soul Origin Crystal that Li Daocheng had given him earlier. With this, Li Daocheng's wallet immediately bulged. 10 million low-grade spirit stones and 300,000 mid-grade spirit stones. This money was enough for Li Daocheng to buy the materials needed to craft a rank 12 talisman. With Princess Catherine's help, Li Daocheng didn't need to buy the Usnea poison liquid. This was the most expensive material to craft a high-grade talisman. It was sold by the milliliter, and 1 milliliter cost 500,000 low-grade spirit stones. About 10 milliliters was the amount needed to craft a talisman. One day later, Li Daocheng brought the sleeping little monkey, old Ghost Zhang, and Princess Catherine out of the Yin clan and came to the underground city once again. This time, they were going to the Shadow Serene Square to gather materials. At the same time, old Ghost Zhang could come up with a plan to repair Tsang Ink. A young man, a curvaceous woman, and an old man with wrinkles all over his face. This combination was somewhat special. When they entered the Shadow Serene Square, they immediately attracted the attention of many people. These three people were Li Daocheng, Princess Catherine, and old Ghost Zhang. After the shabby monkey ate its fill at the old mansion, it curled up in Li Daocheng's arms and fell asleep. No matter how loud the commotion outside was, it didn't disturb it at all. It slept soundly. Li Daocheng walked at the front. The moment he stepped into the Shadow Serene Square, Sang Jiao immediately ran up to him like the wind. "Mr. Li." "No, Jiao Jiao should call you Senior Li now." Sang Jiao smiled as she looked at Li Daocheng. Like last time, Sang Jiao did not shy away from giving Li Daocheng a big hug. It was as if they were lovers who had just met after a long separation. When concubine Sei saw this scene, her eyes revealed a bit of surprise. She immediately had a higher opinion of this woman who dared to hug Li Daocheng. In Princess Catherine's mind, Li Daocheng was no doubt a demon. Her beauty was useless in front of him. The scene of her being tortured to death that day was still fresh in her mind. Just thinking about it made Princess Catherine's hair stand on end. Sung Jiao was now the boss of the Shadow Serene Square branch on Red Sun Planet. She personally received them, so naturally there were no obstructions. Sung Jiao brought the three of them directly into her office. Li Daocheng did not stand on ceremony and directly stated his intentions. He also told Sung Jiao the items he needed. Seeing the list of items, Sung Jiao looked troubled. There were more than a dozen items, and none of them were ordinary. Even the Shadow Serene Square would find it difficult to get them all at once. However, Sang Jiao did not show it. Since Li Daocheng had said it, even if it was difficult, she had to get it. "Senior Li, I can get these materials, but it will take some time." Sung Jiao told the truth. "How long will it take?" Li Daocheng asked. 3 days. Sung Jiao immediately replied. "Okay, then I'll stay here for 3 days. Just tell me how much you need." Li Daocheng nodded. According to the normal market price, it will cost about 4 million elementary spirit stones. Senior Li is an old friend of our Shadow Serene Square, and is my benefactor. I'll give you a 50% discount. 2 million elementary spirit stones will do, Tsang Jiao said happily. When old Ghost Zhang heard Tsang Jiao's 50% discount, his jaw almost dropped. 50% discount? Old Ghost Zhang had been in the Shadow Serene Square for dozens of years, but he had never heard of a 50% discount for a customer. Generally, it would be a 5% discount or 10% discount. Even the biggest customers or Yuanning's cultivators would only get a 20% discount. Tsang Jiao immediately offered a 50% discount. As far as old Ghost Zhang knew, she did not have the authority to do so unless she paid for it herself. This girl really valued Li Daocheng. However, she had not misjudged him. Until now, Li Daocheng's momentum had not slowed down at all. Instead, it had sped up. Zheng Li, you don't have to give me so much every time. I still remember your previous favor. Let's just go with the original price this time. Li Daocheng was not short of money and did not want to owe too many favors. Tsang Jiao wanted to say something, but Li Daocheng had already thrown the storage bag to her. There are 10 million elementary spirit stones inside. You can use it to buy the materials and return it to me when you're done. 10 million elementary spirit stones were given to Tsang Jiao, which fully showed Li Daocheng's trust in her. Tsang Jiao felt happy in her heart. Of course, she knew what Li Daocheng's action meant. Old Ghost Zhang smiled. This girl's goodwill towards Li Daocheng had not been in vain. With such a big backer, it would be convenient for her to do anything in the future. Li Daocheng and Wei Beitong's relationship was also not ordinary. Tsang Jiao, this girl, had made the right bet. Tsang Jiao then arranged for Li Daocheng and the other two to stay in the highest standard guest room in the Shadow Serene Square. Over the next 3 days, old Ghost Zhang worked on the repair plan for Tsang Ying while studying the chilling soul source crystal and the heavy marrow heptagram silver core. Princess Catherine, with Li Daocheng's acquiescence, went shopping in the Shadow Serene Square, buying a large number of spiritual liquids and spiritual medicines for her future cultivation. Li Daocheng was not stingy. He put all the things Princess Catherine bought on his bill. Before, he had been threatening Princess Catherine, and now it was time to do her a favor. Li Daocheng spent most of his time in the room. While consolidating his cultivation, he began to study the Great Void sword technique. Now it was time to practice this mysterious technique. After studying for half a day, Li Daocheng asked Tsang Jiao to send over tons of top-grade spiritual liquids, dozens of bottles of various recovery spiritual medicines, and a set of spirit gathering array. With these things, Li Daocheng was a little relieved. Entering the interface of the hot-blooded upgrader, a holographic window appeared in front of Li Daocheng. There was a very simple sentence written on it. Do you want to practice the Great Void Sword technique? Li Daocheng took a deep breath and chose yes. The moment he chose. Boom! Chapter 427. Li Daocheng collapsed in an instant, sweating profusely all over his body. The majestic spirit chi in his body seemed to have been sucked out. He was so exhausted that he didn't even have the strength to raise his hand. Li Daocheng thought that with the cultivation of Jin Dan middle stage, he wouldn't be too embarrassed to learn divine powers. But he still underestimated the Great Void sword technique. Thump! Li Daocheng couldn't support himself anymore. He sat cross-legged on the bed and fell to the ground. His vision turned black, and he didn't know anything. After an unknown period of time, Li Daocheng opened his eyes with difficulty. He just had a dream. He was practicing a set of sword technique in a closed space and repeatedly practiced it tens of thousands of times. He also fought with various mirror puppets that he couldn't see clearly. He couldn't stop even if he wanted to. At this time, Li Daocheng had a complete and mysterious set of Great Void sword technique in his sea of consciousness. It was as if he had learned it since he was born. But now Li Daocheng didn't have the strength to think too much. Just thinking about the sword technique gave him a splitting headache. Li Daocheng used all his strength to turn his wrist and look at the time on his wristwatch. He had been unconscious for more than 10 hours. The spiritual liquid vat was less than 2 meters away, but Li Daocheng crawled for more than 10 minutes before he climbed into the vat. Splash! Li Daochong flipped into the vat and splashed the spiritual liquid. When his whole body was immersed in the spiritual liquid, he quickly felt much more comfortable. His sore body greedily sucked in the spiritual liquid as if it was thirsty. After being reborn, Li Daochong's body had transcended the mortal body and became a spiritual body. The speed at which his skin absorbed the spiritual liquid was several times faster than before. In just a few minutes, more than half of the spiritual liquid in the vat, which was the size of 2 bathtubs, was gone. The remaining half of the spiritual liquid was turbid and viscous, with some black impurities. Li Daochong's body felt much better. He could already support his body and stand up. He poured the turbid liquid away and filled it with fresh spiritual liquid again. After repeating this 3 times, Li Daochong finally recovered some spirit qi. Some color returned to his pale face. Li Daochong ate some more elixirs, and his exhaustion finally disappeared. However, the spiritual energy in his body was still very empty. Although the hot-blooded upgrader could instantly cultivate a type of cultivation technique, the body would have to bear a huge burden. It was equivalent to projecting years or even decades of cultivation into one's body and mind in an instant. If his cultivation wasn't high enough, he might just die from exhaustion if he tried to cultivate a powerful cultivation technique. Li Daochong had been careful enough. He had waited for so long without touching the Great Void swordsmanship. It was not until the middle stage of Jin Dan that he made the decision to cultivate it. However, Li Daochong still underestimated the thickness of the Great Void sword technique. Even Jin Dan, who was in the middle stage, almost could not withstand it. During the moment of cultivation, Li Daochong even felt the threat of death. His body was instantly hollowed out, and even the most powerful Sun Jin Dan in his body was almost unable to withstand it. What level was this cultivation technique? Li Daochong looked at his hands. 2 faint Tai Chi patterns appeared in his palms. In the middle, there was a sword-shaped shadow spinning at high speed. This was not a cultivation technique. No matter how he looked at it, it was more like a kind of magical power. Li Daochong couldn't figure out what was going on for the time being. He could only wait for the effect to be seen in the future. Li Daochong sat in the spiritual liquid vat again and adjusted his breathing. There was still a long way to go before his body completely recovered. A day and a night passed. Li Daochong almost used up all the spiritual liquids and elixirs that he had prepared. Only then did he basically recover. After sitting for half a day, the spirit qi in his body was completely restored. When Li Daochong walked out of the room, it was already 3 days later. Sung Jiao arrived as promised. She had obtained more than a dozen items in sufficient quantity. Seniorly, everything you want is here. Sung Jiao looked very tired. She had spent a lot of effort to obtain these high-grade materials. She had barely slept in the past 3 days. She had used all the channels available to her and purchased them at a high price. The materials that Li Daochong needed were of higher grade each time. This time, Sung Jiao had already reached her limit. If there was a next time, Sung Jiao didn't know if she could collect everything again. Li Daochong glanced at the items that Sung Jiao took out and nodded slightly. Then, he put them all into his storage ring. Sung Jiao returned the remaining spirit stones to Li Daochong. A total of 5 million elementary spirit stones were used. More than 300,000 of them were used by Princess Catherine. Li Daochong knew that it wasn't easy to obtain these materials. If it wasn't for Sung Jiao's position, he probably wouldn't have been able to obtain even a third of it. Li Daochong took out an empty storage bag. He put some spirit stones into it and threw it to Sung Jiao. This is your commission. I can't let you work for free. Seniorly, it's Sung Jiao's honor to work for you. How can I take your commission? Sung Jiao refused. Just take it. It's what you deserve. Li Daochong didn't want to waste time and frowned. Sung Jiao saw that Li Daochong was unhappy and didn't dare to refuse. She took the storage bag and swept it with her mental force. She was shocked. There were 1 million elementary spirit stones inside. She didn't think that Li Daochong would give her so much. Li Daocheng's return this time had taken a lot longer than he had expected. Many things had happened in between, one after another. Li Daocheng originally thought that he would return to the Blue Bay Star and return to the Scarlet Sun Star in a week. He didn't expect that a month would soon be up. It was time to report to the North Star University. He had agreed to meet Tang Xian for a month. There were only a few days left. It would take 5 days to travel from the 4th ring star zone to the 2nd ring star zone using the fastest flight. Li Daocheng directly went to the only teleportation array on the Scarlet Sun Star. Although the cost of teleportation was shocking, Li Daocheng didn't lack spirit stones. He could afford it even if he brought Princess Catherine and Old Ghost Zhang. The three of them spent 900,000 elementary spirit stones to teleport from the Scarlet Sun Star to the Dark Parasol Star. The teleportation array on the Dark Parasol Star was much more selective. There were more than 10 teleportation arrays on the Dark Parasol Star. They were all channels to different cultivation planets. However, entering the 3rd ring star field wasn't something that could be done casually. Li Daocheng had his identity verified. He was already a student of the North Star University and had the official admission notice. Princess Catherine and Old Ghost Zhang didn't have it. They couldn't enter the 3rd ring star zone. It was useless even if they provided the teleportation fee. Li Daocheng had no choice but to look for spiritual master Huaiyang and go through some procedures. In the end, Princess Catherine and Old Ghost Zhang were verified as Li Daocheng's servant and follower. When spiritual master Huaiyang saw Li Daocheng again, he was shocked. It had only been a month, and this kid's cultivation had broken through again. This cultivation speed was comparable to those freaks in the Central Star Zone who were treasured by the Federation. It was also Li Daocheng's first time entering the 4th ring star zone. His heart was filled with curiosity. Princess Catherine was even more excited. She never dreamed that she would be able to enter the 3rd ring star zone of the Shenhua Federation. The 3rd ring star zone belonged to the Outer Federation. The 3rd ring star zone was the core of the Shenhua Federation. Only Old Ghost Zhang was calm. He had come from there in the past. After 3 teleportations, the 3 of them arrived at Yuanchang Planet, the cultivation planet where North Star University was located. This was a 2nd-class cultivation planet, which was much higher than Kangwu Planet. There were at least hundreds of Yuanine cultivators on Yuanchang Planet. There were even great cultivators in the late and peak stage of Yuanine. In the 3rd ring star zone, the power of families was no longer the main force. Instead, the power of cultivation companies had become the main force. No matter how powerful a family was, it could not compete with a large cultivation company. Although there were some super families among the major shareholders of many cultivation companies, they mostly acted as investors. The people who truly controlled the cultivation companies were those powerful cultivators and special cultivation talents. In fact, cultivation companies were a little similar to the sects and gangs of ancient times. However, they were more cohesive and professional. They were also more humane and changed faster. In order to gain a foothold in the company, one had to have real skills. They either had to be able to bring benefits to the company or had to be a technical talent. You had to know what others did not. Otherwise, you would be eliminated very quickly. It was the unchanging rule of cultivation companies that only the capable could survive. No one could stay in their position forever. There were no elders, deacons, or clan leaders in cultivation companies. The highest authority was represented by the board of directors. Then, there was a clear management hierarchy from the CEO to the director, department heads, and so on. This was almost the same as the world Li Daocheng came from. The teleportation array was the greatest historical relic left behind from ancient times. There was no other one like it. Li Daocheng and the other 2 had crossed the vast starry sky from Red Sun Planet to North Star Planet. If they had taken the fastest flying shuttle, it would have taken about 5 days and 5 nights, and they would have had to make several space jumps. However, using the teleportation array only took 7 or 8 hours. In fact, if they only calculated the teleportation time, it would not have taken more than 20 minutes. The reason why it took 7 or 8 hours was that they needed to rest after each teleportation. With Li Daochong and Jean Dan's cultivation, they were not afraid of the impact of the teleportation. However, Princess Catherine and old Ghost Zhang could not bear it. The two had to rest for 1 or 2 hours before continuing with the next teleportation. Otherwise, there would be negative consequences. If it was just Li Daochong alone, it would have taken less than half an hour to reach North Star Planet from Red Sun Planet. Of course, the speed was fast, but the cost was shocking. If Li Daochong had not plundered the Red Sun Planet and obtained the chilling Soul Source Crystal, he would not have been able to afford this teleportation. After the three of them had gone through 4 teleportations, they had spent a total of 3,800,000 elementary grade spirit stones. Li Daochong had spent the 10 million elementary grade spirit stones that he had obtained from the Yi family in just a few days. He still had 300,000 medial grade spirit stones on him. After coming out of the teleportation array on the outskirts of North Star City, the three of them immediately took a public flying shuttle and entered North Star City. In terms of scale, North Star City was not much different from Blue Bay Star's Tianyuan City. The number of people in the area were basically the same. However, there were tens of thousands of cultivators flying in the sky above North Star City. At a glance, they were densely packed like grasshoppers. On the other hand, flying shuttles were flying back and forth in an orderly manner at a specific height below. North Star City was much more prosperous than Kanwu Star. If Blue Bay Star was a remote village, then Kanwu Star was at best a county town. North Star City was a real metropolis. Even if it had not reached the level of a first-class cultivator city, it was not far from it. The only difference was that between Hangzhou and Shanghai, Princess Catherine looked out the window at the countless cultivators flying back and forth on their flying swords. The streets below were filled with pedestrians wearing all kinds of robes. She suddenly felt like a villager entering the city. Princess Catherine's dress was avant-garde and fashionable enough. However, when she entered the metropolis, she immediately felt ashamed of her inferiority. Ardwolf, that girl seems to be a monster. She looks so beautiful. Behind the public flying shuttle, 2 big men, one tall and one short, stared at Princess Catherine for a long time with shifty eyes. They did not move their eyes away from her since she got on the bus. The short man rubbed his hands and said. The tall man was bald and had a threatening aura. The people on the public flying shuttle consciously distanced themselves from him. He was a body practitioner in the middle stage of the Qi gathering. His muscles were like lumps of iron. The short man's length was injured, but his width was considerable. He was full of fat, and his pair of small eyes were only a line. There was a ferocious scorpion tattoo on their necks. The locals avoided this tattoo in fear. This was the symbol of the Scorpion Gang in North Star City's Star River District. The tall man, who was called Ardwolf, had a greedy look in his eyes. He grabbed the buttocks of a young man in front of him. The young man groaned, and his face turned red. However, he did not dare to make a sound, and his body was trembling. Ardwolf raised his wristwatch and scanned it. It immediately showed some information about Princess Catherine. Ardwolf licked his lips. Erju, it's a monster girl. When Erju heard this, his small linear eyes emitted a brilliance. Ardwolf, good stuff. If you sell her in the underground city, she'll be worth at least a few 100,000 elementary spirit stones. Ha! Ardwolf slapped the back of Erju's head. Erju grimaced in pain. Why did you hit me? Chapter 428. There weren't many people on the public flying shuttle. There were dozens of seats, but only a dozen or so people were sitting. This kind of flying shuttle, which mainly relied on flying spiritual arrays, didn't have a driver. Those who took the public flying shuttle were all grassroots office workers from the suburbs, typical of the North Star Planet's drifters. As people at the bottom of society, these people were afraid to avoid gang members like the Scorpion Gang. Therefore, the seats around the 2 punks, Ardwolf and Erju, were empty. Everyone gathered in the front with a tacit understanding. Only a young man sat behind the 2, and a woman and an old man sat in the middle. Sitting alone in the back was naturally Li Daochong. He sat in the back for no particular reason, just to get a better view of the outside world. Because there was a skylight at the top of the back row, he could directly see the cultivators flying back and forth in the sky, as well as the radiance above North Star City. The conversation between Ardwolf and Urju fell into Li Daochong's ears word for word. In addition to feeling a little funny, Li Daochong also cast a trace of sympathy for the two punks. Li Daochong hoped that these two punks were just talking and wouldn't really do anything. Otherwise, they might die very miserably. Li Daochong saw the two punks stand up and walk towards Princess Catherine. He shook his head slightly and continued to look out the window. After a while, two screams were heard. Ardwolf and Urju, the two punks, fell to the ground as if they had been electrocuted. "Little girl, you've got guts. Just wait for me. I'll show you," Ardwolf said ruthlessly. Ardwolf got up and connected his wristwatch to send a message. Princess Catherine glanced at the two with contempt. She didn't care. She didn't understand who gave them the courage to take liberties with her. The two punks awkwardly sat back in their seats, but their eyes revealed a bit of ferocity. The whole thing ended as quickly as it started. The passengers in the front row didn't want to cause trouble. They hurriedly looked back and acted as if nothing had happened. After seeing Princess Catherine's delicate little face, 2 or 3 young men showed a bit of regret. One of the young men shook his head and whispered to his friend sitting next to him, "That woman is so beautiful. She provoked the Scorpion Gang. It's over." His friend next to him said, "Isn't it? More than 10 days ago, a young couple provoked the Scorpion Gang. Relying on their little ability, they injured 3 members of the Scorpion Gang. As a result, the couple disappeared from the face of the earth. 3 days later, the man's body was found in a ditch in the suburbs. The woman was even worse. She was played by more than 10 people and then transported to the Black Prison to be sold to a devil cultivator from the Eastern country." After the young man heard this, the look of regret on his face became even more intense. He wanted to be the hero to save the beauty, but he didn't have the strength to do so. A beautiful woman sitting behind them was so scared that her face was pale and her body was trembling. Just thinking about it was scary. When the public flying shuttle stopped at the station, the woman didn't care if she had arrived at her destination and immediately got off. With Princess Catherine's hearing, how could she not hear the conversation between the two men? As for the content, she sneered at it. She didn't put a small gang in her eyes. A month ago, she was still a hall master of one of the 3 major gangs in the Federation, the Blood Knife Society. About 10 minutes later, the bus stopped at Xingyang Street Station. There was still some distance from North Star University. However, Li Daochong didn't plan to go directly to North Star University. Xingyang Street was the famous miscellaneous treasure trading market in North Star City. To put it bluntly, it was a bit similar to the antique market, but it was much more complicated than the antique market. There were many more varieties, from the ancient cultivation era to the great cultivation era. The time span was tens of thousands of years. During this period, there were countless treasures with various uses. There were all kinds of things, real and fake. Li Daochong did a simple investigation of North Star City during the break in the teleportation. Li Daochong didn't plan to live in the dormitory arranged by North Star University. That would be too restrictive. Moreover, he had Princess Catherine and Old Devil Zhang with him. There was also the Shabai monkey. They couldn't live in the dormitory with him. Therefore, Li Daochong decided to buy a shop in the miscellaneous treasure trading market. First, it would allow Old Devil Zhang to continue doing business. Li Daochong knew Old Devil Zhang through trading. Second, with an independent residence, it would be more convenient for Li Daochong to do things. Princess Catherine could be Old Devil Zhang's assistant, and the Shabai monkey could be raised as a pet. Li Daochong still had 300,000 mid-grade spirit stones on him. If converted to low-grade spirit stones, it would be 30 million. This amount of money was enough to buy a luxurious residence for mortals in a metropolis like North Star City. If he wanted to buy a cultivation room specially prepared for cultivators, this amount of money would not be enough. The name Xingyang Street had almost been forgotten. It was now called Miscellaneous Treasure Street. Li Daochong directly got off the public flying shuttle from the back door. Princess Catherine and old Devil Jean got off from the middle door. Princess Catherine had just gotten off the shuttle when she was surrounded by a group of burly men. When the crowd around the platform saw this, they all moved aside. Ardwolf and Air Zhu had a sinister smile on their faces. Ardwolf licked his lips and said, "Little girl, aren't you good at fighting? Let's see if you can still beat so many people." Princess Catherine frowned. This was not the end. She took advantage of the situation and struck out with her palm. Ardwolf's body, which was nearly 2 meters long, was directly slapped away. He fell more than 10 meters away and fell flat on his face. "Little girl, you're courting death." Seeing Ardwolf being sent flying, Air Zhu glared and cursed. When the group of burly men saw this, they thought that this girl was actually beating up a member of the Scorpion Gang in public. She was really tired of living. They immediately swarmed up to beat up Princess Catherine. "Stop!" Suddenly, a shout rang out. When the group of burly men heard the voice, they could not help but shiver. They turned around and saw a slender young man wearing a brass robe walking over. The dozen or so burly men immediately bowed to the young man and said in unison, "Sir Copper Scorpion." Ardwolf got up from the ground with a dusty face. He carefully ran to the young man and bowed. "Sir Copper Scorpion, why are you here?" Copper Scorpion glanced at Ardwolf in disgust and snorted. "Do I need to report to you where I go?" Ardwolf's face turned pale when he heard this. He directly knelt down and said with a sad face, "Sir Copper Scorpion, please don't be angry. I didn't mean that. I just think that such a small matter doesn't need you to come forward." At this moment, not only Ardwolf but the scattered crowd also showed a look of horror when they saw Copper Scorpion. Copper Scorpion's notoriety had long been known in this area. As the third leader of the Scorpion Gang, Copper Scorpion naturally had his own abilities. His cultivation level of the middle stage of the Foundation Establishment stage was the best proof. A Foundation Establishment stage cultivator in a regional gang was enough to show how high the North Star star was. This was unimaginable outside the third ring star zone. How could a cultivator be involved with a gangster? The Scorpion Gang mainly engaged in debt collection, pimping, and slave-selling businesses in the North Star City. As soon as Ardwolf's voice fell, Copper Scorpion raised his foot and stepped on Ardwolf's shoulder. Ardwolf didn't dare to make a sound. He was no longer as fierce as before and just let Copper Scorpion trample on his dignity. Copper Scorpion then turned to Princess Catherine and smiled. "Beautiful lady, they were too rude. Please forgive them." Copper Scorpion politely extended his hand. Princess Catherine didn't expect this guy, who had a high status among the gangsters, to be so gentlemanly. Princess Catherine didn't think much of it. She didn't hit a smiling person. Her face was still cold, but she still extended her hand to shake his hand. The moment Princess Catherine extended her hand, Li Daochong, who had been looking at the street map on the other side of the platform, had a flash of brilliance in the corner of his eyes. Li Daochong felt that something was wrong when Copper Scorpion extended his hand. He was about to stop Princess Catherine from shaking his hand when he saw a small flying shuttle at a low altitude. It had lost control for some reason and was emitting black smoke. It swooped down and crashed into a little girl who was carrying a basket of purple flame flowers in her hand. The pedestrians on both sides of the street exclaimed. Li Daochong didn't even think about it. He instantly appeared beside the little girl and pulled her away. The flying shuttle scraped the ground and burst into dazzling sparks, leaving a long scorch mark on the ground. The little girl was saved. Everyone secretly breathed a sigh of relief. Even the gangsters of the Scorpion Gang were attracted to look over. "Thank you, little brother." The little girl looked up at Li Daochong with a pair of big watery eyes and said crisply. There was a hint of shyness in her tender voice. In a trance, Li Daochong thought of the silver bottle. However, the little girl's unusual calmness surprised Li Daochong. Even an adult would be scared silly in the face of such a sudden incident, unable to recover for a long time. Although the little girl's delicate little face had a frightened expression, Her brain did not short-circuit, nor did she not know what to do. She immediately expressed her gratitude to Li Daocheng. Her mind was very clear, and she didn't panic at all. The little girl looked like she was only 8 or 9 years old. To be able to have such wisdom, she had either gone through hardships or was born with a calm mind. "You're welcome," Li Daocheng replied with a gentle smile. The way she called him little brother sounded very comfortable. "Little brother, here you go." The little girl took out a purple flame flower from a basket and handed it to Li Daocheng. Her big watery eyes were filled with eagerness. The purple flame flower was a kind of low-grade spirit flower that had extremely harsh conditions to grow. It didn't have much value by itself, but it was beautiful and took a long time to bloom. Cultivators didn't care about this kind of spirit flower, but mortals valued it very much. It symbolized passionate love. It was a bit like the roses on earth. The purple flame flower grew on cliffs. Because cultivators didn't cultivate it, mortals couldn't grow it either. If one wanted to get this kind of flower, they could only go to the cliffs to pick it. One flower could be sold for hundreds of Federation coins, and the price would be even higher during festivals. The little girl's hand was full of small cracks. This was a pair of hands that shouldn't appear on an 8 or 9-year-old child. Li Daocheng took the flower and squatted down to pat the little girl's face. "What's your name?" The little girl was a little embarrassed and pursed her lips. She seemed to be a little dissatisfied with Li Daocheng patting her face without permission. However, seeing that Li Daocheng had just saved her life, she didn't hold it against him. She paused for a moment and replied, "My name is Xiaoling River." "Xiaoling River," Li Daocheng repeated and continued. "How much did this flower cost?" Xiaoling River quickly shook her head. "Little brother, this is a gift from me. It's free." Li Daocheng smiled and took out 2 mid-grade spirit stones and stuffed them into Xiaoling River's little hand. At the same time, he took the flower basket from her hand. "I want all your flowers." Looking at the 2 mid-grade spirit stones in her hand, Xiaoling River was a little dumbfounded. Of course, she knew what spirit stones were, but she had never really touched this kind of currency that existed among cultivators. It was said that 1 spirit stone was worth a few thousand Federation coins. 2 spirit stones were more than enough to buy her basket of purple flame flowers. Xiaoling River only knew about spirit stones, but she didn't know that spirit stones were divided into different grades. The value of a mid-grade spirit stone was much higher than that of a beginner spirit stone. When Xiaoling River recovered from her shock, Li Daocheng had already walked away with the flower basket. Li Daocheng saved Xiaoling River and exchanged a few words. The entire process took less than 2 minutes. On the platform, Princess Catherine reached out to shake Copper Scorpion's hand. The latter's smile immediately deepened. Just as Princess Catherine was about to speak, she felt the world in front of her begin to spin. Old Devil Zhang, who had been standing beside Princess Catherine, noticed that something was wrong. "Girl, are you all right?" Princess Catherine gritted her teeth and raised her hand. The hand that had just touched Copper Scorpion was slightly red and itchy. "You poisoned me," Princess Catherine said angrily. "Poisoned you? How could I? I just poisoned you. How could I, Copper Scorpion, do something as despicable as poisoning you?" Copper Scorpion said shamelessly. "You." Princess Catherine felt dizzy and the breath in her body was chaotic. She couldn't gather any strength and was about to collapse. Copper Scorpion stepped on Ardwolf and held Princess Catherine's waist. He looked down at Ardwolf and said, "You've been in the Scorpion Gang for so many years. What else can you do besides relying on the gang's power to do things without thinking? Don't you know how to use your brain? Aren't you just a snake girl in the early stage of Foundation establishment? You made it so complicated and even mobilized so many people to come here. Look at you." Copper Scorpion kicked Ardwolf away. Ardwolf rolled on the ground a few times before he got up. Copper Scorpion picked up Princess Catherine and turned to leave. However, as soon as he turned around, he saw a young man standing behind him with a flower basket in his hand. Copper Scorpion was so scared that he almost jumped up. He didn't feel anything and had no idea that someone was standing behind him. "If you don't want to die, put her down." Chapter 429. Old Devil Zhang didn't move at all. He didn't know Snake Girl very well. As an experienced vendor, Old Devil Zhang would never do anything that didn't benefit him. Besides, with Li Daochong around, he didn't need Snake Girl's help. When Li Daochong finally stood up, Old Devil Zhang suddenly felt sorry for these street ruffians. Of all the people to mess with, they had to mess with Li Daochong. Weren't they just digging their own graves? There were 3 major gangs in the Federation. One of them was destroyed by Li Daochong, and the other one had a special relationship with Li Daochong. How could a motley crew challenge Li Daochong? Was this a joke? Old Devil Zhang shook his head subconsciously. Li Daochong's tone was calm, and his expression was indifferent. He didn't look aggressive at all. Instead, he was very gentle. Copper Scorpion quickly recovered from his momentary shock. Looking at the harmless young man who was carrying a basket of flowers and whose aura was only at the refinement stage, his face immediately turned cold. "Kid, do you know who you're talking to?" Li Daochong picked up a purple flame flower from the basket. He pinched the stem between his thumb and forefinger, then put it under his nose and took a deep breath. His expression showed that he was enjoying it. It smelled so good. As for what Copper Scorpion was saying, Li Daochong didn't care at all. "How dare you block Master Copper Scorpion's way? Are you tired of living?" A bald man next to him shouted and rushed up to punch Li Daochong in the face. Sigh, a soft sigh. A petal fell from the purple flame flower in Li Daochong's hand. Whoosh! It flew through the air. Ah! The bald man screamed and knelt on the ground. His knees were bleeding as if they had been cut by a sharp weapon. Copper Scorpion's pupils suddenly shrank. The way he looked at Li Daochong suddenly changed. "Friend, do you want the Snake Girl?" Copper Scorpion changed his tone and asked in a negotiating manner. Li Daochong patted Copper Scorpion's shoulder and said calmly, "I won't kill you today since the kid is here. Next time, if I see you bullying the weak and taking women by force, I'll crush your bones and scatter your ashes." It was Li Daochong and the other 2. If it were other people, they would be bullying the weak and taking women by force. Copper Scorpion's eyes flashed coldly. "Friend, I don't care where you come from. You'd better ask around. What does the Scorpion Gang do?" Zhang, Copper Scorpions, he put the flowers in the basket, and give them to old Zhang. "Zhang, take care of them." "Zhang's old Zhang. He's Zhang's T.S." Just as old Zhang was about to move, Copper Scorpion waved his hand and knocked the basket to the ground. Old Zhang was stunned. He looked at Copper Scorpion with widened eyes and said earnestly, "Young man, you've really messed with the wrong person. Isn't it good to be alive?" The fear that Copper Scorpion had just shown towards Li Daochong suddenly disappeared. A tall and sturdy man in silver robes descended from the sky. Silver Scorpion. Another big shot of the Scorpion Gang had arrived. Silver Scorpion didn't hide his aura at all. The pressure of the building foundation stage spread all over the place. With the platform as the center, the area within a radius of 100 meters was suppressed by his unbridled aura. Many passers-by fell to the roadside in pain. Some of them had suffered internal injuries and even fainted. Lord Silver Scorpion. The gangsters of the Scorpion Gang became even more frightened and shouted in unison. As soon as Silver Scorpion landed, he looked greedily at Princess Catherine, who was in Copper Scorpion's arms. No other race could compare with Elamia's figure. Their waists were small and their breasts were high. Their buttocks and long legs were the standard. Concubine Say was the best among the snake women. Whether it was her appearance or her figure, she was the best among the snake women. Silver Scorpion was called Silver Scorpion because of his lewd nature. Li Daochong didn't seem to see Silver Scorpion's arrival. He scanned the surroundings with his psychic power and found that there were at least a dozen children nearby, except for Shaoling River. Obviously, this was not a good place to kill them. As a good young man, Li Daochong naturally didn't want to leave a shadow in the hearts of these children. It would be bad if they were molded into murderous maniacs. Li Daochong turned to look at old Zhang and said, "Mr. Zhang, do you think it's better to let them die quietly or let them go on the road with a deep impression?" Old Zhang thought for a moment and replied seriously, They've done so many bad things. Wouldn't it be too easy for them to die quietly? Well, that makes sense. Li Daochong nodded slightly. What are these two idiots talking about? Are they out of their minds? No, 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 I think they're scared out of their wits. Several gangsters from the Scorpion Gang sneered after hearing the conversation between Li Daochong and Old Zhang. However, as soon as they finished speaking, an invisible force suddenly entangled them. Then, their vision blurred and the sound of wind whistling in their ears. More than 10 seconds later, when their vision recovered, they found that they were no longer where they were before. They were even no longer in the city. The flourishing North Star City was right next to them, and they were in a wasteland on the outskirts. It seemed to be a cemetery. More than a dozen gangsters were confused and didn't know what had happened. Ardwolf and Urju were baffled. It was fine if the gangsters didn't know what was going on. After all, their cultivation was low. Silver Scorpion and Bronze Scorpion were also confused. Bronze Scorpion maintained his posture of hugging someone, but there was nothing in his hands. Snake Girl was leaning next to Li Daochong at this moment and seemed to have regained some consciousness. "Master, I'm sorry," Princess Catherine said weakly. "This is not your fault, but you have to work harder in the future. It's your shame to be plotted against by such trash," Li Daochong said lightly. "Yes, Master." Princess Catherine was weak, but her attitude was very firm. Li Daochong helped Princess Catherine sit down as if there was no one else around. Silver Scorpion said in a deep voice, "Who are you?" There was a hint of fear in his voice. "Dead people don't need to know too much." Li Daochong's tone was calm as usual, as if he was just talking about something very normal. For example, "Have you eaten?" Something like that. As soon as he finished speaking, Li Daochong slapped his palm across the air. Bang! Bronze Scorpion did not react at all. His chest was hit hard and caved in. He spat out a mouthful of blood and looked at Li Daochong in shock. "You." Bronze Scorpion could only spit out one word and could no longer speak. The heart-wrenching pain made him fall to the ground and roll in pain. This blow directly shattered Bronze Scorpion's spiritual root and injured all his internal organs. At the same time, he did not die on the spot. His blood vessels were intact, and the nerve pain was stimulated just right. Li Daochong moved his telekinesis, and several telekinesis threads shot out. In an instant, the 7 Scorpion Gang gangsters' eyes were glazed, and then they began to go crazy and attack their companions. The 7 Scorpion Gang members were like mad dogs, pouncing on their companions and biting and scratching. Screams rose one after another in the wilderness, being eaten by their companions who lived with them day and night. That kind of horror was not something that ordinary people could understand. Only Ardwolf and Erju were not attacked, and they did not go crazy. However, the two of them were completely dumbfounded at this time. Their forelegs could not help but tremble. They did not know what had happened to them. How could the insufferably arrogant Scorpion Gang become like this? Li Daochong was still standing there. No one could tell what he had done at all. At least, no one present had the ability to see any clues. The fear in Silver Scorpion's heart continued to rise. He had probed the aura of the strange young man in front of him more than once. However, every time he probed, there was nothing. He could not sense his existence at all. Did I really see a ghost? Although Silver Scorpion cursed in his heart, he knew that it was not a ghost. It was just that the cultivation of the young man in front of him had far exceeded his understanding. A Gene Dan cultivator? Silver Scorpion sucked in a breath of cold air. With a thud, Silver Scorpion directly knelt in front of Li Daochong. "Senior, I was blind. I didn't know that you were here. Please forgive me. I'm willing to serve you like an ox or a horse and work for you." There was no trace of emotion in Li Daochong's eyes. He said, "No need. There's only one chance. If you miss it, you miss it. I guess you've hurt a lot of people. Compared to ghosts, you may be more terrible." With that, Li Daochong reached out his hand and patted Silver Scorpion's head. When the latter heard this, he knew that it was useless to say anything. Silver Scorpion's eyes narrowed. Since he was going to die anyway, he might as well fight. After thinking about it, he roared and the aura in his body burst out violently. He was ready to fight Li Daochong to the death. However, as soon as Silver Scorpion's aura burst out, the young man standing in front of him, who seemed to be just an ordinary person, burst out with an incomparably terrifying aura. It easily crushed Silver Scorpion's aura. Yuanying's Qi. Silver Scorpion's mind instantly went blank. Even Copper Scorpion, who was rolling on the ground in pain, was dumbfounded. What kind of existence had they provoked? At that moment, Silver Scorpion suddenly thought of a popular saying, "You have to pay for what you've done." Li Daocheng's cultivation was naturally far from Yuanying's Qi, but his Jin Dan was the Sun Jin Dan. Whether it was the capacity of spiritual energy, purity, or condensation, it was far superior to other Jin Dan cultivators of the same level. As a responsible general, he was invincible under Yuanying. Even a very powerful Wu Gui in the intercourse was scared to death by Li Daocheng's Eye of Thunder Punishment. Not to mention that they were only two foundation establishment cultivators. Li Daocheng stretched out his index finger, and some lightning appeared on his fingertip. He tapped it lightly. Was it bag spring? Was it broken? Was it a double stillness? Silver Scorpion wanted to escape, but he couldn't move. His whole body was penetrated by lightning. Yin Shun Fu Silver Scorpion felt as if he had been pricked by tens of thousands of needles. Drops of blood seeped out of his pores. His face was distorted. The pain was like the punishment of the 18 layers of hell. Ardwolf and Urju were like dead ashes. This young man, who had appeared out of nowhere, was now the incarnation of the Grim Reaper in their hearts. Copper Scorpion and Silver Scorpion were the two supreme bigwigs of the Scorpion Gang. They were high and mighty cultivators, and they weren't ordinary cultivators either. They had once seen Silver Scorpion cripple several cultivators who had come looking for trouble with the Scorpion Gang. Copper Scorpion was sinister and cunning. He was quite skilled in using poison. Although he didn't seem as strong as Silver Scorpion, in a real fight, many cultivators would probably choose Silver Scorpion over Copper Scorpion. His battle record was even more impressive. At least 2 Jin Dan cultivators had died at his hands. They had been poisoned to death. You got guts. You dare to have designs on my maid? I heard everything you said on the public flying shuttle. Li Daocheng turned his face and looked coldly at the two scared out of their wits. Thud. Ardwolf and Urju were so scared that their lips turned purple. At the same time, they knelt down and kowtowed desperately. Upper Immortal, please spare our lives. Upper Immortal, please spare our lives. We were blind, the two wailed. Feeling that begging for mercy was far from enough, Ardwolf and Urju slapped their own mouths. Li Daocheng just looked at them indifferently and didn't say anything. It wasn't until their faces were swollen and their mouths were full of blood that Li Daocheng looked at Princess Catherine and asked indifferently, "Do you want to kill them?" Princess Catherine stared blankly. Her beautiful eyes were filled with doubt and incomprehension, but she was a little shocked in her heart. She had never thought that Li Daocheng would actually ask for her opinion. Based on her contact and understanding with Li Daocheng these days, this master never asked other people for their opinions. Was this a test for her? Or did he want to see if she had any other uses besides secreting venom? Princess Catherine's beautiful face throbbed slightly. Whether Li Daocheng meant it or not, she had to answer this question carefully. After a 2 or 3 second pause, Princess Catherine said, "Master, I think you can spare their lives." "Oh, give me a reason." Li Daocheng was eager to hear the details. "Master, this is your first time on planet North Star, so you don't know much about this place. It should be locals and can be spies. Besides, this time Master will be staying on planet North Star for a long time. You need people to develop your power. They could be your spokespeople in the lower gray areas of planet North Star." Princess Catherine spoke her thoughts. "Well, then I'll leave them to you," Li Daocheng responded. Princess Catherine was delighted. She guessed right. Master was testing her to see if she had any other uses. She should pass the first test. Princess Catherine took out 2 black pills and coldly said, "Open your mouths." Ardwolf and Urju didn't dare resist. They obediently opened their mouths. Princess Catherine flicked her hand, and the 2 black pills shot into their mouths. "If you don't want to die, swallow them. Princess Catherine's voice was cold. The two's desire to live didn't allow them to make the slightest movement. They swallowed the pills, then opened their mouths to show Princess Catherine that they'd eaten them. You've taken the poison pills I refined. You won't be affected for 7 days. But after that, if you don't take the antidote, you'll rot into a pool of black liquid. In 3 days, I'll find you. Now get out of here. Concubine Say was as timid as a little white rabbit in front of Li Daochong. But at this moment, in front of the two gangsters, she regained the majesty that she should have had as a home master of the Blood Dagger Gang. Ardwolf and Urju felt as if they'd been pardoned. They rolled and crawled away. As for the poison, they didn't dare to ask too much. They were afraid that if they asked too much, the young man would have an idea and kill them immediately. Die immediately or die in 7 days. It wasn't difficult to choose. One more day was one more day. Li Daochong glanced around coldly. At this time, the wilderness had returned to its former tranquility. A gust of wind blew, and the grass rustled. Whoosh! Li Daochong's figure disappeared. Together with Princess Catherine, they turned into a ray of light in the sky, leaving behind more than 10 corpses with twisted faces under the tall grass. Li Daochong returned to the shuttle station. It only took a few minutes. Zhang Laogui had just picked up the scattered purple flame flowers and put them back into the flower basket. When he got up, Li Daochong had already returned with Princess Catherine. Are you done? Old Ghost Zhang asked simply. Done. Li Daochong nodded slightly. He put one hand on Princess Catherine's shoulder and injected a stream of spiritual energy into the latter's body. Princess Catherine, who was limp all over, felt refreshed. Poof! She spat out a mouthful of black blood, and the poison disappeared. Thank you, Master. Princess Catherine bowed respectfully. Her eyes were full of horror. Li Daochong's strength seemed to have increased a lot. She couldn't see through this young man anymore. How could there be such a terrifying guy in the world? Princess Catherine couldn't summon the slightest thought of resisting Li Daochong. She was as docile as a little white rabbit. She didn't have the temperament that a demon snake should have. Let's go and see the houses. Li Daochong withdrew his hand and walked in the direction of Miscellaneous Treasure Street. The passers-by around didn't know what had happened. Where were the members of the Scorpion Gang who were in front of them just now? At the far corner of the street, a small figure hid behind a big tree and watched everything that happened near the station. It was the little girl selling flowers, Xiaoling River. Little brother isn't immortal, Xiaoling River murmured. She lowered her head and looked at the 2 spiritual stones in her hand. Then, she carefully put them in her pocket and turned to leave. You're tuning into the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.